I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who'd end up standing at a funeral, trembling with rage instead of grief. But here I am, about to tell you the story that destroyed my marriage, shattered my trust, and turned me into someone I barely recognize. My name is Grace Sullivan, I'm 34 years old, and the day my father-in-law died was the day I discovered that the man I'd loved for 8 years was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. Before I go any further, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because I need to know I'm not alone in this. I need to know that somewhere out there, someone understands what it feels like when your entire world collapses in a single moment. And if you're settling in to hear this whole story, please hit that subscribe button now, because what I'm about to share with you is raw, it's real, and it's the kind of truth that doesn't get told enough. Check the description box below for more stories like this, stories about survival, betrayal, and the kind of revenge that changes everything. It started on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 weeks before the funeral that would change everything. I was in our kitchen in Portland, Oregon, making coffee in the French press that Derek's father, Thomas Calloway, had given us for our 5th anniversary. The morning light was hitting the marble countertops just right, making everything look clean and perfect, the way our life was supposed to be. Derek came downstairs in his grey suit, the one that made his blue eyes look almost silver, and he kissed my forehead the way he always did, quick, distracted, already halfway out the door in his mind. He worked in commercial real estate, closing deals that brought in 6 figures, while I managed a small non-profit that helped resettle refugee families. We weren't wealthy by Portland standards, but we were comfortable, stable, the kind of couple that people looked at and thought had it all figured out. That morning, Derek's phone rang while he was pouring his coffee, and I watched his face change. It wasn't dramatic, just a slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in his posture, but I'd been married to him long enough to notice. He answered with a clipped hello, then walked into the living room, lowering his voice. I didn't think much of it at the time. Derek was always getting calls about properties, negotiations, clients who needed hand-holding. But when he came back into the kitchen, his face was pale, and his hand was shaking slightly as he set down his phone. "That was my mom," he said quietly. "Dad had a stroke. They're taking him to OHSU. Oregon Health and Science University, the place you go when things are serious." I felt my stomach drop, not just because Thomas was sick, but because of the way Derek was looking at me, like he was seeing straight through me to something I couldn't understand. We grabbed our coats and drove in silence through the wet Portland streets, the windshield wipers beating a rhythm that matched my racing heart. If you've ever gotten that call, the one that tells you someone you love is slipping away, you know exactly how I felt in that moment. Time becomes elastic, stretching and compressing, and all you can think about is getting there, like your presence alone might be enough to hold them to this world. Thomas survived the stroke, but barely. The doctors said he had maybe a week, maybe 2 if we were lucky. He was conscious but couldn't speak, couldn't move the right side of his body, could only watch us with those sharp green eyes that Derek had inherited. For the next 18 days, I watched my husband transform. He became someone I didn't recognize, distant, jumpy, constantly checking his phone with an expression that looked like dread. At first, I thought it was grief. I thought he was preparing himself for the loss of his father, the man who taught him to fish in the Willamette River, who'd walked him through his first real estate deal, who'd always been the steady anchor of the Calloway family. But there was something else, something that made my skin prickle with unease every time I caught him staring at his father's hospital bed with an expression that looked less like sorrow and more like fear. The funeral was scheduled for a Saturday in late March at a small chapel in Lake Oswego, the upscale suburb where Derek had grown up. Thomas had been specific in his final wishes. He'd written them down years ago in a letter that his wife, Margaret, kept in a locked drawer in their bedroom. Small ceremony, close family only, burial in the family plot at Riverview Cemetery. Margaret had always been the kind of woman who followed rules to the letter, and even in her grief, she was determined to honor every detail of Thomas's requests. The morning of the funeral, I stood in front of our bedroom mirror trying to zip up my black dress, the same one I'd worn to my grandmother's funeral 2 years earlier, and I caught Derek's reflection behind me. He was sitting on the edge of our bed, already dressed in his black suit, staring down at his hands like they belonged to someone else. "You okay?" I asked, turning to face him. He looked up, and for just a second, I saw something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. It wasn't grief. It was terror. The chapel was exactly what you'd expect. Dark wood pews, stained glass windows filtering weak March sunlight, the heavy smell of lilies that always makes me think of death. There were maybe 40 people there, mostly Thomas's colleagues from his law practice and a handful of distant relatives. Derek's younger sister, Caroline, was there with her husband, both of them red-eyed and subdued. Margaret sat in the front row, ramrod straight in her black dress, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, looking like she might shatter if anyone touched her. I sat next to Derek in the second row, my hand resting on his thigh, feeling the tension radiating through his muscles like he was about to bolt. The service was traditional, predictable. A minister who'd clearly never met Thomas reading generic platitudes about a life well lived, a few carefully chosen hymns, a eulogy from one of Thomas's law partners that hit all the expected notes. Through it all, Derek sat beside me like a statue, barely breathing, his eyes fixed on his father's closed casket at the front of the chapel. Then came the moment when we were supposed to view the body, that awful tradition where you file past the casket and say your final goodbye to someone who doesn't look like themselves anymore. Margaret went first, pressing her thin fingers to Thomas's cold hand for a long moment before stepping back. Caroline and her husband went next, both of them crying quietly. Then it was our turn. Derek stood up slowly, like his legs might not hold him, and I followed, my hand on his back for support. We approached the casket together, and I looked down at Thomas's face, waxy and still, his green eyes closed, his hands folded over his chest. He looked smaller than I remembered, like death had diminished him. Derek stared down at his father for what felt like an eternity, his jaw working like he was trying to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, he leaned down, and I thought he was going to kiss his father's forehead, the way people do, but instead, he reached into the casket. His hand moved quickly, almost furtively, and when he straightened up, I could swear I saw him slip something into his jacket pocket. It happened so fast that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Almost. We returned to our seats for the final prayers, and that's when everything started to unravel. We were sitting there, my hand in Derek's, his palms sweaty and trembling, when I felt him suddenly grip my fingers so hard it hurt. I turned to look at him, and his face had gone completely white. His eyes were wide, fixed on something I couldn't see, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. "Darling, I want to leave now," he whispered, his voice so tight it barely sounded like him. The minister was still talking, people were still bowing their heads in prayer, but Derek looked like he was about to have a panic attack right there in the church. "What's wrong?" I whispered back, trying to keep my voice calm even though my heart was starting to race. He turned to me then, and I'd never seen that expression on his face before, pure, undiluted fear. "Haven't you looked under the table?" he said, his voice trembling so badly I could barely understand him. For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. "What table?" I whispered, but he was already pulling on my hand, trying to get me to stand up, to leave with him right there in the middle of his father's funeral. And that's when I looked down. We were sitting at one of those old-fashioned church pews with a small table in front of it, the kind meant to hold hymnals and prayer books. I'd been so focused on the service that I hadn't paid attention to anything else. But now, as Derek's grip on my hand turned almost painful, I let my eyes drop to the space beneath that table. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. There was something there, an envelope, cream-colored and thick, taped to the underside of the table directly in front of where Derek was sitting. Written on it in black marker, in handwriting I recognized as Thomas's, were 3 words that made my stomach drop, "For my son." If you've ever had a moment where you realize that everything you thought you knew was wrong, where reality shifts beneath your feet and you can't find your balance, you know exactly what I felt in that second. My hands went numb. My vision tunneled. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice was screaming that whatever was in that envelope was going to destroy us. Derek was pulling on my hand harder now, his breath coming in short gasps, and I could see people starting to notice our disturbance. Caroline was looking over at us with concern, and Margaret had turned in her seat, her steel-grey eyes boring into Derek with an expression I couldn't read. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at that envelope, at those 3 words written in a dead man's handwriting, and I knew, that Thomas had left a message for Derek, had planned this moment, had arranged for his son to find this envelope at his own funeral. What kind of father does that? What kind of secret is so devastating that it has to be delivered from beyond the grave? Derek finally managed to pull me to my feet, and we stumbled out of our pew and down the side aisle, every eye in that chapel following us. I could hear the minister's voice faltering, could feel the weight of everyone's judgment, but Derek didn't stop. He pulled me through the chapel doors and out into the parking lot, where the cold March air hit my face like a slap. The moment we were outside, Derek let go of my hand and bent over, hands on his knees, gasping like he'd just run a marathon. I stood there watching him, my mind spinning with questions I was afraid to ask. "Derek," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, too calm, too level. "What was in that envelope?" He straightened up slowly, and when he looked at me, I saw something that made my blood freeze. It wasn't just fear in his eyes anymore. It was guilt. "I can't," he said, shaking his head. "I can't tell you, Grace. Not yet. Not here." Behind us, I could hear the chapel doors opening, voices spilling out into the parking lot. The service was ending, and soon everyone would be filing out, would be looking for us, asking questions. "Did you take it?" I asked. "Did you grab that envelope?" Derek closed his eyes and nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement. "Before the service," he whispered. "When we were viewing the body. I saw it then. I took it." So I hadn't imagined it, that moment at the casket when his hand had moved so quickly, when I'd thought he was just saying goodbye to his father, but he was actually stealing something. Stealing what? A letter. Evidence. A confession. We didn't go to the reception. Derek drove us home in complete silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the grey Portland streets blur past, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't grief. This wasn't normal. Whatever Thomas had left for Derek in that envelope, it was big enough to make my husband fall apart in front of 40 people at his own father's funeral. When we got home, Derek went straight upstairs to our bedroom and locked himself in. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, listening to the sounds of drawers opening and closing, and I felt the first real stirrings of anger cutting through my shock. Who was this man I'd married? What was he hiding? I waited an hour, then two, pacing our living room, my mind racing through possibilities. An affair? A secret child? Illegal business dealings? Each option seemed more horrifying than the last. Finally, around 7 that evening, Derek came back downstairs. He looked like he'd aged 10 years, his face was haggard, his eyes bloodshot, and he was carrying a bottle of whiskey that was already a quarter empty. "I need to tell you something," he said, and his voice was so hollow it didn't even sound like him anymore. We sat down on opposite ends of our couch, the same couch where we'd cuddled and watched movies 1,000 times, where we'd planned our future, where we'd talked about maybe having kids someday, and suddenly it felt like there was a mile of space between us. Derek took a long drink from the bottle, then set it down on the coffee table with shaking hands. "My father," he began, then stopped. Started again. "My father left me a letter. And a package. And Grace, his voice broke, and he put his face in his hands. "I don't know what to do." I waited, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "What did it say?" I asked quietly. Derek looked up at me, and I saw tears streaming down his face. "He knew," Derek whispered. "He knew everything. About the money. About what I did. About all of it." And just like that, the floor dropped out from under me. The thing about betrayal is that it doesn't hit you all at once. It starts as a pinprick, a tiny puncture in the fabric of your reality, and then it spreads, slowly at first, then faster, until everything you thought you knew is unraveling around you. That's what it felt like sitting on my couch, watching my husband cry, hearing words that didn't make sense but somehow made perfect, horrible sense. "What money?" I heard myself ask, and my voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone else. Derek wiped his face with the back of his hand, took another drink, and then started talking. And with every word, I felt the life I'd built crumbling away. "It started," he said, 3 years ago. We'd been trying to buy our first house, not the rental we lived in now, but something we could own, something permanent. Derek had been working on a major commercial deal, a shopping center development in Beaverton that was supposed to be his big break. The commission alone would have been enough for a down payment, enough to finally stop feeling like we were treading water financially. But the deal had fallen through at the last minute when the primary investor pulled out. Derek had been devastated. I remembered that time, remembered him coming home looking defeated, remembered holding him while he talked about how close they'd been, how much work he'd put in. What I didn't know, what he'd never told me, was that he'd already spent the commission. Not literally, he hadn't received the money yet, but he'd made commitments based on it. He'd borrowed against it. He'd promised his business partner, a man named Marcus Chen, that he'd invest $100,000 in their next venture. He'd told Marcus the money was coming, that it was guaranteed, and Marcus had made plans based on that promise. When the deal collapsed, Derek had panicked. That's when Thomas had stepped in. Derek's father had always been successful, not wealthy in the flashy way, but comfortable, secure, the kind of lawyer who'd built a solid practice over 30 years and invested wisely. Derek had gone to him, confessed the situation, and Thomas had done what any father might do, he'd helped. He'd written Derek a check for $100,000. But it came with conditions. Thomas made Derek sign a promissory note, a formal legal document promising to repay the loan with interest within 3 years. It was supposed to be a private arrangement between father and son, a way to teach Derek responsibility while also saving him from professional ruin. Derek had agreed to everything, had been grateful, had sworn he'd pay it back. He'd never told me any of this. For 3 years, while I'd thought we were building our life together, making joint decisions about our future, Derek had been hiding a 6-figure debt to his own father. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, and I could hear my voice starting to shake with anger. "Why would you keep something like that from me?" Derek looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Because I was ashamed," he said. "Because I didn't want you to know I'd failed. Because I kept thinking I could fix it before you found out." But he hadn't fixed it. The years had passed, and Derek had made minimum payments when he could, had missed payments when he couldn't, had watched the interest compound while he told his father that business was slow, that the market was tough, that he needed more time. Thomas, according to Derek, had been patient at first. Then firm. Then, in the last year of his life, increasingly angry. They'd had arguments, quiet, tense conversations that Derek had hidden from me, phone calls that he'd taken in his car or in his office, always out of my earshot. Thomas had wanted his money back. Derek hadn't had it. And then Thomas had had his stroke, and Derek had thought, God help him, he'd actually thought, that maybe the debt would die with his father. But Thomas Calloway hadn't been the kind of man to leave loose ends. The letter Derek had found taped under the table at the funeral had been devastating in its precision. Thomas had written it weeks before his death, while he was still lucid, still sharp, still the calculating attorney who'd spent his career anticipating problems and closing loopholes. In the letter, Thomas explained that he'd attached documentation of the loan, copies of the promissory note, records of every payment Derek had made or missed, a calculation of the current amount owed with interest. It came to $147,000. The letter informed Derek that Thomas had made arrangements for this debt to be collected from his estate after his death. But there was a choice. Derek could either pay the debt immediately, within 30 days of Thomas's death, or the documentation would be turned over to Margaret, to Caroline, and to the IRS. Because Derek had never declared the loan on his taxes. He'd never reported it, never paid taxes on the forgiven interest, never done any of the things that made this transaction legal and above board. If the documentation went public, Derek wouldn't just lose his relationship with his family. He'd face an audit, penalties, possibly criminal charges for tax fraud. Thomas had given his son 1 month to come up with $147,000, or lose everything. It was punishment and mercy wrapped together, the act of a father who loved his son but couldn't forgive him for his weakness. And it was working. I could see it destroying Derek right in front of me. "There's more," Derek said, and somehow I knew I didn't want to hear what came next. He reached into his jacket pocket, the same jacket he'd worn to the funeral, and pulled out a small flash drive. "This was in the package," he said, holding it up. Dad kept records. Not just of the loan. Of everything. I didn't understand at first. Everything. Derek nodded, his face crumpling again. My business dealings. The corners I've cut. The deals that weren't exactly legal. The clients I've lied to. Dad was watching me, Grace. He was documenting everything, and he left it all for me. Insurance, he called it. Insurance to make sure I'd pay him back. I stared at the flash drive dangling from Derek's fingers, and I felt something cold and hard settling into my chest. How bad is it? I asked. Derek couldn't look at me. Bad enough that if any of it gets out, I'll lose my license. My career. Probably face prosecution. The room was spinning. I stood up, needing to move, needing to do something with the energy that was building inside me like a scream. So your father blackmailed you, I said. Yes, Derek whispered. And you lied to me for 3 years. Yes. About money. About debt. About illegal business dealings. Grace, I'm sorry. Don't, I snapped, spinning to face him. Don't you dare apologize to me right now. But Derek was crying again, great heaving sobs that shook his whole body. I don't have the money, he gasped out between sobs. I've been trying to save it, trying to put together enough, but we don't have it, Grace. We're barely keeping up with bills as it is, and I don't have $147,000, and the 30 days started today, and I don't know what to do. I should have comforted him. I should have said we'd figure it out together, that we'd find a way, that he wasn't alone. But I didn't. Because in that moment, I wasn't thinking about Derek or his problems or even his dead father's cruel insurance policy. I was thinking about 3 years of lies. 3 years of me working 50-hour weeks at my non-profit, taking on extra projects, skipping vacations because we needed to save money, all while Derek had been sitting on a secret debt that dwarfed anything I could have contributed. 3 years of me trusting him completely, never questioning, never doubting, while he'd been living a double life. I need you to leave, I said, and my voice sounded like ice. Derek looked up at me, shocked. What? I need you to leave this house right now, I repeated. I need you to go somewhere else tonight, because if you stay here, I'm going to say things I can't take back. Grace, please, Gio. I shouted, and the force of it surprised both of us. Derek stood up slowly, like a man in a dream, picked up his jacket, and walked to the front door. He paused there, his hand on the doorknob, and looked back at me. I love you, he said quietly. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because I didn't know if I loved him anymore, didn't know if the man I'd loved had ever really existed or if he'd always been this stranger standing in my doorway, this liar, this fraud. When the door closed behind him, I stood alone in my living room and felt the tears finally come. But they weren't sad tears, not the kind you cry when you lose something precious. They were angry tears, bitter tears, tears of rage at being betrayed and lied to and made to feel like a fool. I grabbed the whiskey bottle Derek had left on the coffee table and threw it across the room. It hit the wall and shattered, amber liquid streaming down the cream-colored paint like blood. The sound was satisfying, a physical manifestation of the destruction I felt inside. I wanted to break everything. I wanted to scream until my throat was raw. I wanted to hurt Derek the way he'd hurt me. But instead, I sank down onto the floor surrounded by broken glass and whiskey fumes, and I started to think. Because here's what Derek didn't understand, what he'd never understood. I wasn't just some non-profit manager playing at charity work. I'd spent the last 6 years helping refugee families navigate complex bureaucratic systems, fighting against government agencies, finding loopholes and workarounds and solutions to impossible problems. I knew how to research. I knew how to investigate. I knew how to build a case. And if Derek thought he was the only one with secrets, he was about to discover how wrong he was. I spent that night on my laptop, and I didn't sleep at all. First, I checked our bank accounts, all of them, including the ones Derek thought I didn't know about. I'd always been careful about our finances, had always kept my own records, but now I was looking for patterns, for discrepancies, for signs of the lies. And I found them. There were transfers I couldn't account for, payments to Marcus Chen's business that Derek had categorized as consulting fees, withdrawals that lined up exactly with Thomas's payment schedule. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, and I'd been too trusting to see it. Then I did something I'm not proud of. I hacked Derek's email. It wasn't hard. We'd shared passwords for years, back when we had nothing to hide from each other. He'd changed some of them, but not all, and I knew him well enough to guess the patterns. By 4 a.m, I was reading through years of correspondence between Derek and Marcus, between Derek and his father, between Derek and clients I'd never heard of. And what I found made me physically sick. The illegal dealings Thomas had documented weren't just corner-cutting or ethical grey areas. Derek had been falsifying documents on property deals. He'd been lying to investors about zoning restrictions. He'd been taking kickbacks from contractors in exchange for favorable recommendations. Some of it was small-time stuff that might only cost him his license. But some of it, particularly a deal involving a low-income housing development that had mysteriously been rezoned for luxury condos, was serious fraud. People had lost homes because of what Derek had done. Families had been displaced. And Derek had made tens of thousands of dollars in the process. I'd built my career on helping vulnerable people. I'd dedicated my life to fighting for refugees, for families with nothing, for the powerless and forgotten. And I'd been married to a man who'd made his money by crushing those same people. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. Before I share what I did next, I need you to hit that like button if you're still with me. I know this is heavy. Believe me, I know. But if you've ever been lied to by someone you trusted completely, if you've ever discovered that your entire life was built on someone else's deception, then you understand why I couldn't just let this go. And make sure you check the description box below for more stories about betrayal, revenge, and survival, because you're going to want to follow what happens next. By the time the sun came up on Sunday morning, I'd made a decision. Derek thought he had 30 days to come up with $147,000 before Thomas's insurance policy destroyed him. But I was going to destroy him first. Not out of spite, or not just out of spite. I was going to destroy him because he deserved it, because justice demanded it, because the families he'd hurt deserved someone to fight for them even if they never knew I had. I was going to take every piece of evidence Thomas had collected, every document Derek thought was safely hidden, every secret he'd been keeping, and I was going to use it to tear down everything he'd built. But I was going to be smart about it. I wasn't going to confront him directly, wasn't going to give him a chance to cover his tracks or turn this around on me. I was going to move carefully, methodically, the way I'd learned to move in my work, building a case, gathering allies, preparing for every possible response. And I was going to start with the one person who could tell me everything I needed to know about Thomas's final arrangements, Margaret Calloway, my mother-in-law, the woman who'd always looked at me like I wasn't quite good enough for her precious son. It was time to find out if she knew what her husband and son had really been doing. It was time to find out whose side she was on. Margaret Calloway had never liked me, and I'd always known it even though she was too well-bred to say it outright. She was the kind of Portland society woman who'd grown up with money, married into more money, and spent her life perfecting the art of polite disdain. She wore pearls to brunch, spoke in measured tones that made every sentence sound like a judgment, and had a way of looking at people, especially me, that made you feel like you'd shown up to a black tie event in jeans. When Derek and I had gotten married 8 years ago in a small ceremony at a vineyard in the Willamette Valley, Margaret had smiled for the photos but couldn't hide the disappointment in her eyes. I wasn't what she'd wanted for her son. I came from a working-class family in Eugene, my parents were divorced, I worked for a non-profit instead of a corporation, and I didn't know the difference between a dessert fork and a salad fork. In Margaret's world, those things mattered. But now, sitting in my car outside the Calloway family home in Lake Oswego on Sunday afternoon, I realized that Margaret might be the key to everything. If Thomas had documented Derek's sins so thoroughly, had he told his wife? Did Margaret know about the loan, the fraud, the blackmail from beyond the grave? Or had Thomas kept her in the dark, protecting her from the ugly truth about their son? There was only one way to find out. I texted Derek that morning, a short, cold message saying I needed time and space, that I'd reach out when I was ready to talk. He'd responded immediately with desperate apologies and promises, but I'd ignored them all. Let him suffer. Let him wonder what I was thinking, what I was planning. Let him feel a fraction of the fear and uncertainty he'd put me through. Then I'd called Margaret and told her I wanted to stop by to check on her, to make sure she was holding up after the funeral. She'd sounded surprised but had agreed, her voice as controlled and formal as ever. The Calloway house was exactly what you'd expect, a sprawling craftsman-style home with manicured gardens, a circular driveway, and the kind of understated elegance that whispered money without shouting it. I'd been here dozens of times over the years for family dinners and holiday gatherings, and it had always made me feel slightly uncomfortable, like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life. Today, that discomfort was amplified by what I knew, by the secrets I was carrying, by the fact that I was here under false pretenses. I rang the doorbell and waited, my heart pounding. Margaret opened the door dressed in black slacks and a grey cashmere sweater, her silver hair perfect despite the fact that she'd buried her husband less than 24 hours ago. "Grace," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "This is unexpected." I followed her into the living room, which smelled like furniture polish and old books, and we sat across from each other in matching wingback chairs. Margaret's eyes were dry, her posture perfect, and I realized I'd never seen this woman cry. Not at the hospital when Thomas was dying, not at the funeral, not now. Whatever grief she felt, she kept it locked away behind that impeccable facade. "How are you holding up?" I asked, trying to sound genuine. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "As well as can be expected," she said. "It's strange, you know, being in this house without him. 42 years of marriage, and suddenly you're alone." For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy for her. Then I remembered why I was here and pushed it aside. "I'm so sorry," I said. "And I'm sorry about yesterday. About Derek and me leaving the service the way we did. That must have been embarrassing." Margaret's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Derek seemed quite upset," she said carefully. "Is everything all right between you two?" This was it, the opening I needed. I could feel the weight of Thomas's flash drive in my purse, burning like a live coal, but I kept my face neutral. "Actually," I said slowly, "I was hoping you could help me understand something. Did Thomas leave anything for Derek? Any letters or messages?" The change in Margaret was subtle but unmistakable. Her shoulders tensed, her lips pressed together in a thin line, and her eyes, those sharp grey eyes that missed nothing, fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Why do you ask?" she said, and her voice had gone cold. I'd pushed the right button. Margaret knew something. "Because Derek found something at the funeral," I said, deciding to go with honesty since lying to this woman would be impossible. "An envelope. With documents about a loan he'd taken from Thomas. And Margaret, he never told me about any of it." For a long moment, Margaret just stared at me. Then she stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at her perfect garden. When she spoke, her voice was weary in a way I'd never heard before. "Thomas told me about the loan," she said quietly. "Not at first. Not when it happened. But later, when Derek started missing payments and Thomas realized our son was in over his head. He told me everything." My breath caught. Everything. Margaret turned back to face me, and for the first time, I saw real emotion on her face, a mixture of disappointment and anger and something that looked almost like shame. The loan. The illegal dealings. The fraud. Thomas had been investigating Derek for over a year before his stroke. He couldn't stand what our son had become. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "You knew," I whispered. "You knew what Derek was doing, and you never said anything." Margaret's face hardened. "It wasn't my place to interfere in Derek's marriage," she said coldly. "And frankly, Grace, I thought you must have known. I thought you must have been complicit, or at least willfully blind. After all, you share finances, don't you? You must have seen the signs." The accusation stung because part of me felt like she was right. How had I missed it? How had I been so blind? But I pushed past the shame and focused on what mattered. "Did Thomas tell you about his plan?" I asked. About the 30-day deadline? About the evidence he was leaving behind? Margaret walked back to her chair and sat down, and suddenly she looked every one of her 68 years. He told me he was giving Derek one final chance to make things right, she said. Pay back the debt, face the consequences of his actions, or be exposed. Thomas believed it was the only way to save Derek from himself. He thought that if Derek faced real consequences, maybe he'd finally grow up and become the man he was supposed to be. And you agreed with that? I asked, unable to keep the anger out of my voice. Your husband left a bomb for your son to find at his own funeral, and you thought that was appropriate. Margaret's eyes flashed. Don't you dare judge us, Grace, she snapped. You don't know what it's like to watch your child throw away every advantage they've ever been given. You don't know what it's like to realize the boy you raised turned into a liar and a cheat. Thomas was trying to save Derek, even if it meant breaking him first. We stared at each other across the expensive Persian rug, and I realized that Margaret and I had more in common than I'd ever thought possible. We'd both loved Derek, both believed in him, and both been betrayed by who he really was. What happens now? I asked quietly. If Derek doesn't pay the debt. Margaret stood up again, this time walking to a large mahogany desk in the corner of the living room. She opened a drawer and pulled out a manila folder, thick with papers. If Derek doesn't pay within 30 days, the documentation goes to the IRS, to the Oregon State Bar, and to a list of journalists that Thomas compiled. Everything gets exposed. Derek loses his license, faces prosecution, and this family's name gets dragged through the mud. She turned to look at me, and I saw something calculating in her expression. But Thomas also left me an alternative. My pulse quickened. What alternative? Margaret walked back and sat down, placing the folder on the coffee table between us. Thomas knew Derek might not be able to come up with the money. So he gave me the option to forgive the debt, to destroy the evidence and let Derek walk away clean. I couldn't breathe. Why would he do that? Because despite everything, Thomas loved his son, Margaret said, and her voice cracked for the first time. He wanted to believe Derek could change. So he left the final decision to me. I can choose to protect Derek, or I can choose to expose him. I have 29 days left to decide. The room felt like it was closing in on me. This was bigger than I'd thought, more complicated, more dangerous. Margaret held Derek's entire future in her hands, and I had no idea which way she was leaning. What are you going to do? I asked. Margaret picked up the folder and held it, her fingers tracing the edge. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Part of me wants to protect my son the way I've always protected him. Part of me thinks Thomas was right, that Derek needs to face real consequences or he'll never change. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw a question forming in her eyes. But what I want to know, Grace, is what you're going to do. Are you going to stand by Derek through this? Or are you going to leave him? It was a question I'd been avoiding since Derek's confession. I thought about the 8 years we'd spent together, the promises we'd made, the life we'd built. I thought about the refugee families I'd helped, the people I'd fought for, the principles I'd built my life around. And I thought about Derek falsifying documents, displacing families, destroying lives for profit. I don't know, I said, and it was the truth. I don't know if I can forgive this. Margaret nodded slowly, like she'd expected that answer. Thomas left something else, she said quietly. Something I haven't told Derek about yet. She reached into the folder and pulled out a sealed envelope, smaller than the others, with my name written on it in Thomas's precise handwriting. My hands went numb. For me. Thomas gave it to me 2 days before his stroke, Margaret said. He made me promise to give it to you if Derek told you about the loan. He said you deserved to know the whole truth. I stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it. What could Thomas possibly have to say to me? Why would Derek's father leave me a message? With shaking hands, I took the envelope from Margaret and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and as I read Thomas's words, I felt the world tilt on its axis again. The letter was short but devastating. Dear Grace, if you're reading this, Derek has finally told you about the loan and about his illegal activities. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. But there's something else you need to know, something I've kept secret because I wasn't sure how to tell you, or even if I should. 6 months ago, I hired a private investigator to document Derek's business dealings. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Not just fraud, but an affair. Derek has been seeing someone named Vanessa Park for the past year and a half. She works at Marcus Chen's firm. I have photographs, hotel records, text messages, all of it documented and stored in a safe deposit box at Wells Fargo, downtown Portland branch, box 447. The key is with Margaret. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know the truth about who you're married to. You deserve the chance to make an informed decision about your future. Derek is my son, and I love him, but I love truth and justice more. If you choose to use this information, you have my blessing. If you choose to forgive him and try to save your marriage, you have my blessing for that too. But whatever you decide, do it with your eyes open. You're a good woman, Grace. You deserve better than the lies my son has been feeding you. With respect and regret, Thomas Calloway. The room spun. The words on the page blurred as tears filled my eyes. An affair. For a year and a half. While I'd been working 60-hour weeks at my non-profit, while I'd been supporting Derek through what I thought were career struggles, while I'd been planning our future and believing in our marriage, he'd been sleeping with someone else. Vanessa Park. I'd never heard the name before, but it was seared into my brain now like a brand. I looked up at Margaret, and I must have looked destroyed because for the first time since I'd known her, I saw genuine sympathy in her eyes. Did you know about this? I asked, my voice breaking. Margaret shook her head. Not until I read that letter after Thomas died. He never told me about the affair. I think he was ashamed that he'd raised a son who could betray you that way. I stood up abruptly, the letter falling from my hands, and I felt rage rising up inside me like a wave. Not the cold, calculated anger I'd felt last night, but something hot and fierce and consuming. Derek hadn't just lied about money. He hadn't just committed fraud. He betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible, had broken our marriage vows, had made me believe we were building something real while he was living a completely different life. The key, I said, and my voice sounded strange, disconnected. Thomas said there's a key to the safe deposit box. Margaret stood up and walked back to the desk. She opened a small wooden box and pulled out a brass key on a simple ring. Thomas gave this to me the same day he gave me your letter, she said, holding it out. He said I should give it to you if you asked for it. I took the key, and it felt heavy in my palm, weighted with all the ugly truth it would unlock. Thank you, I said mechanically. I need to go. I turned toward the door, but Margaret's voice stopped me. Grace, she said, and when I looked back, I saw something in her face that I'd never seen before, respect. Whatever you decide to do, I want you to know something. I was wrong about you. I thought you weren't good enough for my son. But the truth is, Derek was never good enough for you. It was probably the kindest thing Margaret Calloway had ever said to me, and it made the tears spill over. I nodded once, unable to speak, and walked out of that perfect house into the grey Portland afternoon. I sat in my car for a long time, the key clutched in my hand, Thomas's letter burning a hole in my purse. I thought about going home, but I couldn't face that empty house, couldn't face the memories that filled every room. I thought about calling Derek, screaming at him, demanding answers. But what would be the point? He'd just lie more, or cry more, or make more promises he had no intention of keeping. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my best friend, Shanice Washington. We'd met 7 years ago when she'd come to my non-profit as a refugee from South Sudan, and over the years, we'd become family. She'd built a life here in Portland, married a kind man named David, and had 2 beautiful kids. She was strong in a way I'd never been, had survived things I couldn't imagine, and she always told me the truth even when I didn't want to hear it. Grace. Shanice answered on the second ring, concern already in her voice. What's wrong? Can I come over? I asked, and my voice broke on the last word. I need someone to talk to. Come now, Shanice said immediately. David will take the kids out. Come, sister. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out. I drove to Shanice's apartment in northeast Portland, and when she opened the door, she took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug. I collapsed against her and finally let myself cry, really cry, for the first time since this nightmare began. She held me while I sobbed, didn't ask questions, didn't tell me it would be okay. She just let me fall apart. When I could finally breathe again, we sat on her worn couch, so different from the expensive furniture at Margaret's house, but infinitely more comfortable, and I told her everything. The loan. The fraud. The affair. Thomas's death and his devastating insurance policy. Margaret's choice. All of it came pouring out, and Shanice listened without interrupting, her dark eyes growing wider with each revelation. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I didn't expect. What do you want to do, Grace? Not what you think you should do. Not what's right or fair or justified. What do you want? I'd been so focused on the betrayal, on the lies, on the evidence and the justice of it all, that I hadn't asked myself that question. What did I want? I want him to hurt, I said finally, and saying it out loud felt like releasing something dark and powerful that had been coiled up inside me. I want him to feel what I'm feeling right now. I want him to lose everything the way I've lost everything. Shanice nodded slowly. Okay, she said. Then let's make a plan. And just like that, I realized I wasn't alone in this. I had an ally, someone who understood betrayal and survival, someone who wouldn't judge me for wanting revenge. The safe deposit box, Shanice said, her mind already working. We need to see what's in there. We need to know exactly what we're working with before we make any moves. She was right. I couldn't plan my revenge without knowing the full extent of what Thomas had documented. Tomorrow, I said. I'll go to the bank tomorrow. Not alone, Shanice said firmly. I'm coming with you. And Grace, whatever you decide to do after we see what's in that box, I've got your back. I squeezed her hand, grateful beyond words. If you're watching this and you've ever had a friend who stood by you when your world was falling apart, drop a comment and tell me about them. Because we all need people like Shanice in our lives, people who don't flinch from our darkness, who help us be strong when we want to give up, who remind us that we're not alone. That night, I went back to my house, but I didn't sleep. I spent the hours until dawn thinking about Derek and Vanessa Park, imagining them together, torturing myself with images I couldn't stop. Where had they gone? Hotel rooms in Portland? Weekend trips they disguised as business travel? Had he taken her to the places he'd taken me, said the same things, made the same promises? The worst part was wondering if he'd ever really loved me at all, or if our entire marriage had been a comfortable lie he'd told himself while he lived his real life somewhere else. By the time Monday morning arrived, I was exhausted but clear-headed. I'd made a decision about what I wanted, and now I just needed the tools to make it happen. Shanice picked me up at 9, and we drove to the Wells Fargo branch in downtown Portland. It was one of those imposing buildings with marble columns and security guards, the kind of place where serious money lives. I walked up to the counter with Thomas's key in my hand and told them I needed to access box 447. They asked for identification, asked me to sign in, led us through a secure door and into a room lined with metal boxes. The bank employee used a master key along with Thomas's key to open the box, then left Shanice and me alone. Inside the safe deposit box was a thick accordion folder, the kind lawyers use for important documents. My hands shook as I pulled it out and set it on the small table in the private room. Shanice put her hand on my shoulder. "You sure you want to do this?" she asked quietly. I nodded and opened the folder. The first thing I saw was a photograph of Derek. He was walking out of a hotel, the Heath Man in downtown Portland. I recognized it immediately, with a woman I'd never seen before. She was beautiful in that polished, professional way that made my stomach twist. Asian American, probably in her early 30s, wearing a business suit and heels, laughing at something Derek had said. His arm was around her waist. They looked happy. They looked like a couple. I flipped through more photographs. Derek and Vanessa at restaurants. Derek and Vanessa walking through Pioneer Square. Derek and Vanessa kissing in a parking garage. Each image was dated and time-stamped. Thomas's investigator had been thorough. The affair had started almost exactly 18 months ago, in April of the previous year. I remembered that time. Derek had told me he was working on a major project with Marcus Chen's firm, that he'd be putting in long hours, coming home late. I'd supported him, had told him I understood, had picked up the slack at home because I thought we were a team. God, I'd been such a fool. Behind the photographs were printed text messages. Hundreds of them, extracted somehow from Derek's phone. Reading them was like swallowing glass. Derek, can't wait to see you tonight. Grace thinks I'm at a client dinner. Vanessa, we should be more careful. Marcus is starting to ask questions. Derek, don't worry about Marcus. He knows how to keep his mouth shut. Besides, what we have is worth the risk. Vanessa, is it? Because I'm tired of being your secret. When are you going to tell her? Derek, soon. I promise. I just need to figure out the right time. So he'd been planning to leave me. Or at least, he'd been telling Vanessa he was planning to leave me. How long had that been going on? How many promises had he made to her while making different promises to me? There were hotel receipts, credit card statements showing purchases at jewelry stores, jewelry I'd never received, and restaurant bills from places Derek had told me he couldn't afford to take me to. Every piece of evidence was another knife in my heart, another lie exposed, another piece of my marriage revealed as fiction. At the bottom of the folder was a handwritten note from Thomas, dated 2 days before his stroke. This is everything my investigator could find. I'm sorry, Grace. I wish I didn't have to show you this. But you deserve to know the truth before you waste more years on my son. T.C. Even in death, Thomas was still trying to control things, still trying to teach Derek a lesson. But he'd also been trying to help me. In his cold, calculated way. He'd given me the information I needed to make an informed choice. Now I just had to decide what to do with it. Shanice had been reading over my shoulder, and when we finished going through everything, she let out a low whistle. That's a lot of evidence, she said. That's a lot of betrayal. I know what I want to do, I said, and my voice was steady now, clear. I want to destroy him. I want to take everything in this box, everything Thomas documented about the fraud, and I want to burn Derek's life to the ground. Shanice looked at me for a long moment. You sure? Because once you start down that road, there's no going back. I thought about the refugee families Derek had displaced with his fraud. I thought about the lies he'd told me for years. I thought about him kissing Vanessa Park while I waited at home, believing in a marriage that didn't exist. I'm sure, I said. Revenge, I learned, is not a single act but a process. It requires patience, precision, and the willingness to become someone you never thought you'd be. Over the next week, I became that person. I stopped crying. I stopped feeling sorry for myself. Instead, I started planning with the cold efficiency of someone who had nothing left to lose. Shanice and I spent hours at her apartment, spreading out all of Thomas's evidence across her kitchen table like war plans. We had photographs of the affair, documentation of Derek's fraud, records of the loan and missed payments, and a detailed timeline of every lie he'd told over the past 3 years. It was overwhelming in its completeness. Thomas Calloway might have been a cruel father, but he'd been a damn good lawyer. The question was, how to use it all for maximum impact. You could just turn him in, Shanice said, playing devil's advocate the way she always did. Give the fraud documentation to the IRS and the Bar Association, let the legal system handle it. You'd be done, and Derek would face consequences. But that's not enough, I said, and I could hear the darkness in my own voice. That's just justice. I want him to feel what I felt. I want him to know what it's like to have everything you believed in ripped away. Shanice nodded. then we need to think bigger. We need to hurt him in multiple ways, professionally, personally, financially. We need to make him understand exactly what is lost. She was right. And as we talked through the options, a plan started to take shape. It was complex, risky, and required perfect timing. But if we pulled it off, Derek wouldn't just lose his career. He'd lose everything. Step 1. Document everything myself. Thomas's evidence was comprehensive, but it was also old. The most recent photographs of Derek and Vanessa were from 2 months ago. I needed to know if the affair was still going on, needed fresh evidence that I could use. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I started following my own husband. I took a week off work, telling my non-profit that I was dealing with a family emergency, which wasn't a lie. Then I sat in my car outside Derek's office building in downtown Portland and watched. He was staying at a hotel, the Marriott near Pioneer Square, because I still wouldn't let him come home. Every morning, I watched him leave for work in his expensive suit, carrying his leather briefcase, looking tired and stressed. Good. Let him suffer. Let him wonder what I was planning. And every evening, I followed him. The first 3 days, he went straight back to his hotel. But on Thursday, he left work early and drove to a condo building in the Pearl District, one of Portland's trendiest neighborhoods. He parked in the underground garage and didn't come out for 3 hours. I sat in my car, my heart pounding, and I knew he was with her. When he finally emerged, I took photographs with my phone. The timestamp, the location, everything. The next day, I went back to that building and waited in the lobby, pretending to be waiting for someone. When a delivery person came with food, I slipped in behind them and took the elevator to the floor I'd seen Derek go to. There were only 4 units on that floor, and one of them had a doormat that said "Welcome" in English and Korean. Vanessa Park. I'd found her. I took more photos of the door, the unit number, the view from the hallway. Then I went back to my car and called Shanice. She lives in the Pearl District, I said. Unit 1204. And Derek was there yesterday for 3 hours. So the affair is still active, Shanice confirmed. Even after his father died, even after you found out about everything, he's still seeing her. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd thought possible. Part of me had hoped that Derek's confession, his tears, his apologies had been genuine. But he'd been lying even then, still sneaking off to see his mistress while begging me for forgiveness. What do you want to do? Shanice asked. I want to meet her, I said, surprising myself. I want to look Vanessa Park in the eye and let her know exactly who she's been sleeping with. Shanice was quiet for a moment. That's risky, Grace. If she warns Derek, he could destroy evidence, could come up with a defense. You'd lose the element of surprise. She was right, but I didn't care. I needed Vanessa to see me, needed her to understand that I wasn't just some abstract concept, the wife Derek complained about or ignored. I was real, and I was done being invisible. I'm going to do it, I said. But not yet. First, I need to know more about her. That weekend, I became a stalker. I looked up Vanessa Park on social media. Her Instagram was public, filled with carefully curated photos of her life. Brunch at trendy restaurants. Hiking trips to the gorge. Professional headshots that showed her standing in front of Marcus Chen's firm, identified as a senior project manager. She looked happy, successful, completely untroubled by the fact that she was sleeping with a married man. Her LinkedIn profile told me more. She graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in business administration, had worked her way up from an entry-level position to senior management at Marcus's firm in just 5 years. She was ambitious, smart, probably saw Derek as a stepping stone to something bigger. I also found out that Vanessa had a younger sister named Julie who lived in Seattle, and that her parents owned a Korean restaurant in Vancouver, Washington. She posted photos of family dinners, smiling with her parents and sister, all of them looking wholesome and close-knit. Did they know about Derek? Did they know their successful daughter was having an affair with a married man? These were all pressure points I could use if I needed to. But I had to be strategic. I couldn't just blow everything up at once. I needed to time each revelation for maximum impact. On Monday morning, I called Derek for the first time since he'd left our house. He answered on the first ring, his voice desperate. "Grace? Oh, thank God. I've been trying to reach you. I need to see you," I interrupted, keeping my voice neutral. "We need to talk about what happens next." I could hear the hope in his voice when he responded. "Yes. Yes, absolutely. When? Where?" "Tonight. 6 o'clock. Meet me at that coffee shop on Division, the one we used to go to." It was a public place, neutral territory, somewhere I wouldn't be tempted to scream at him or break down. "I'll be there," Derek said quickly. "Grace, I just want you to know that I hung up before he could finish. I didn't want to hear his lies anymore." That afternoon, I met with a divorce attorney named Patricia Chen, no relation to Marcus, I'd checked. Patricia was in her 50s, with short grey hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. I'd found her through a recommendation from one of my non-profit colleagues who'd gone through a brutal divorce. "Tell me everything," Patricia said, and I did. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and let out a low whistle, the same reaction Shanice had had. "This is one of the most documented cases of marital fraud I've ever seen," she said. "With this evidence, I can get you a divorce on grounds of adultery and financial fraud. Oregon is a no-fault state, so we don't technically need proof of the affair, but this will help with asset division and potentially spousal support." "I don't want his money," I said. "I want him to have nothing left to give." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "Okay. Then we need to think strategically about timing. If you file for divorce now, before the 30-day deadline on his father's debt, Derek will be forced to disclose all of this in court. The fraud, the affair, everything. It becomes public record." "Good," I said. "What else?" "Well," Patricia said, leaning forward, "if Derek is prosecuted for fraud, and based on what you've shown me, he absolutely should be, you could potentially sue him for financial damages. You could argue that his illegal activities put your joint assets at risk, that you suffered emotional distress from his deception. It's complicated, but possible." "Do it," I said. "File for everything. I want him buried in legal problems." Patricia nodded approvingly. "I'll draw up the papers. But Grace, I have to ask, are you sure you want to go this hard? Divorce is expensive and emotionally draining even in the best circumstances. This kind of scorched earth approach will consume your life for months, maybe years." I thought about Derek kissing Vanessa Park. I thought about the families he'd displaced with his fraud. I thought about 3 years of lies and the marriage that had never really existed. "I'm sure," I said. "When can you file?" "I can have papers ready by the end of the week," Patricia said. "But if you're serious about maximum impact, you should serve him right before or right after something else significant happens. Multiply the stress, overwhelm his ability to respond." The 30-day deadline. That was 23 days away now. If I served Derek with divorce papers the same day Margaret decided whether to expose him or protect him, he'd be dealing with multiple catastrophes at once. "Wait until day 29, I said. "I want him to think he might survive this. Then hit him with everything at once." Patricia smiled, the kind of smile that told me she'd seen plenty of bitter divorces and knew exactly what I was feeling. "I like the way you think," she said. "But what about you? How are you holding up?" It was a question no one had asked me since this started. Everyone wanted to know what I was going to do, what my plan was, whether I was going to forgive Derek or destroy him. But no one had asked how I was actually feeling. "I'm angry," I said honestly. "I'm so angry I can barely sleep. But I'm also," I paused, trying to find the right words. "I'm also relieved. Because for 3 years, I felt like something was wrong but I couldn't put my finger on it. I thought it was me, thought I was being paranoid or insecure. Now I know I was right. My instincts were right. And that's almost worth all of this pain." Patricia nodded. "That's good. Hold on to that. You're going to need it in the coming weeks." I left her office feeling more focused than I had in days. The plan was taking shape, the pieces were moving into place. Now I just had to get through this meeting with Derek without revealing what I knew, without showing my hand too early. If you're still watching, I want you to take a second and subscribe to this channel, because what happens next is going to blow your mind. And check the description below for more stories like this, because everyone loves a good revenge story, especially when it's true. At 6 o'clock, I walked into the coffee shop on Division Street and saw Derek already sitting at a corner table. He looked terrible, his suit was rumpled, his hair was messy, and he had dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. Good. When he saw me, he stood up so fast he almost knocked over his chair. Grace, he said, and his voice cracked. Thank you for meeting me. I didn't think you would. I sat down across from him without hugging him, without any of the physical affection that would normally punctuate this moment. His face fell, but he sat back down. I ordered you a latte, he said, pushing a cup toward me. The way you like it. Extra shot, oat milk. It was such a small, thoughtless gesture, as if a coffee could make up for everything he'd done, but I took it anyway. I needed something to do with my hands, some way to look natural while I lied to his face. We need to talk about logistics, I said, keeping my voice businesslike. About what happens now? Derek nodded eagerly. Yes. Of course. Grace, I want you to know that I'm going to fix this. I'm going to pay back the money, I'm going to clean up the business stuff, I'm going to do whatever it takes to make this right. How? I asked flatly. How are you going to pay back $147,000 in 3 weeks? We don't have that kind of money. Derek hesitated, and I could see him calculating what to tell me, how much truth to share. I've been talking to Marcus, he said finally, about selling my stake in some of our properties. I think I can come up with enough to at least make a significant payment to my mom, show her I'm serious. Maybe she'll give me more time. And the fraud? I asked, watching his face carefully. The illegal deals your father documented? What's your plan for that? Derek's face went white. I'm going to stop, he said quickly. I'm going to go completely legitimate from now on. No more corners cut, no more gray areas. I swear, Grace, I'm done with all of that. He was lying. I could see it in the way his eyes shifted, in the way his hands fidgeted with his coffee cup. He was telling me what I wanted to hear, but he had no intention of actually changing. Okay, I said, pretending to believe him. What about us? What about our marriage? This was the question Derek had been waiting for. He reached across the table and grabbed my hand, and I let him even though his touch made my skin crawl. I love you, he said intensely. I know I've made mistakes, I know I've lied to you, but Grace, you're the most important thing in my life. I can't lose you. Please tell me we can work through this. I looked into his blue eyes, the same eyes I'd fallen in love with 8 years ago, and I felt nothing. No love, no affection, not even hatred. Just a cold, calculated determination to see this through to the end. I need time, I said slowly. This is a lot to process, Derek. The money, the lies, all of it. I need space to figure out if I can forgive this. Derek's face lit up with hope. Of course. Take all the time you need. I'll do anything, Grace. Therapy, counseling, whatever you want. Just don't give up on us. I nodded, squeezed his hand once, then pulled away. I should go, I said, standing up. I'll call you in a few days. Derek stood too, looking like he wanted to hug me but wasn't sure if he should. Thank you for meeting with me, he said. Thank you for giving me a chance. I walked out of that coffee shop without looking back, and I felt a grim satisfaction settling into my bones. Derek thought he'd bought himself time. He thought I was considering forgiving him, working through our problems, saving our marriage. He had no idea that I'd already filed for divorce, that I was documenting his every move, that I was building a case that would destroy him. He had no idea that in 3 weeks, His entire world was going to collapse. And he definitely had no idea that tomorrow, I was going to do something that would change everything. I was going to meet Vanessa Park. There's a particular kind of courage required to confront the woman your husband has been sleeping with, and I wasn't sure I had it. But as I stood outside Vanessa Park's office building on Tuesday morning, watching professionals stream in and out for their morning meetings, I felt something harder than courage settling into my chest: determination. I'd spent the night before rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd approach her, trying to predict every possible reaction. Would she cry? Would she attack me? Would she deny everything? Shanice had offered to come with me, but I'd told her no. This was something I needed to do alone. I needed to look Vanessa in the eye and make her see me as a real person, not just an obstacle between her and the life she wanted. Marcus Chen's firm was on the 8th floor of a glass tower in downtown Portland, the kind of building that screamed money and success. I dressed carefully that morning, a navy blue suit that made me look professional and put together, my hair pulled back, minimal jewelry. I wanted Vanessa to see that I wasn't some frumpy housewife she could dismiss. I was Derek's equal, maybe his superior, and I deserved respect even if I wasn't going to get it. The receptionist looked up as I walked in. "Can I help you?" she asked with a practiced smile. "I'm here to see Vanessa Park," I said, my voice steady. "I don't have an appointment, but it's urgent. Personal matter." The receptionist's smile faltered slightly. "Let me see if she's available. Can I have your name?" "Grace Calloway," I said, and I watched the recognition flash across the receptionist's face. So she knew who I was. That was interesting. She picked up the phone, spoke quietly into it, then looked back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Ms. Park will see you. Conference room B, down the hall on the left." My heart was racing as I walked down the hallway, passing offices where people were typing at computers and talking on phones, completely unaware of the confrontation about to happen in their midst. Vanessa was waiting for me in the conference room, standing by the window with her arms crossed. She was wearing a charcoal grey dress and heels, her long dark hair falling perfectly around her shoulders. In person, she was even more beautiful than in Thomas's photographs, and I felt a stab of jealousy that I immediately pushed down. This wasn't about comparing myself to her. This was about making her face what she'd done. "Grace," she said, and her voice was cool, controlled. "I have to admit, I wasn't expecting you to show up at my office. Should I have called first?" I asked, matching her tone. "Made an appointment to discuss how you've been fucking my husband for a year and a half." A flash of emotion crossed Vanessa's face, surprise, maybe, or anger, but she recovered quickly. "I think you should sit down," she said, gesturing to one of the conference chairs. "No, thank you," I said. "I'll stand. This won't take long." We faced each other across the polished conference table, two women connected by the man we'd both been sleeping with, both been lied to, both been used. "How did you find out?" Vanessa asked finally. I laughed, a bitter sound. "Does it matter? The point is I know. I know about the hotels, the restaurants, the text messages where Derek promised to leave me for you. I know everything." Vanessa's jaw tightened. "Then you also know that Derek hasn't been happy in your marriage for years. That he's been staying with you out of obligation, not love. That what we have is real, not just some affair." The words were meant to hurt, and they did. But I prepared for this, had steeled myself against exactly this kind of attack. "If what you have is so real," I said quietly, "why are you still his secret? Why hasn't he left me? Why is he still sleeping in our bed every chance I give him, still telling me he loves me, still begging me to forgive him?" Vanessa's confidence wavered. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that 3 days ago, Derek met me at a coffee shop and swore he'd do anything to save our marriage," I said, watching her face carefully. "I'm talking about the fact that even after I found out about his illegal business dealings, his lies, his fraud, even after all of that, he told me I was the most important thing in his life." I pulled out my phone and showed her a screenshot of a text Derek had sent me just that morning. *Good morning, Grace. Just wanted you to know I'm thinking about you. I love you so much. Please give us another chance. Asterisk the timestamp was from 2 hours ago, probably sent right before or after Derek had spent the night at Vanessa's apartment. The color drained from Vanessa's face. He said. She stopped, swallowed hard. He told me he'd told you about us. He said you two were separated, that the divorce was just a matter of paperwork. There is no divorce, I said coldly. Or there wasn't until I filed for one yesterday. But Derek doesn't know that yet. He thinks I'm considering forgiving him, working through our problems. He's playing both of us, Vanessa. He's telling you what you want to hear and telling me what I want to hear, and he's hoping he can keep this going until he figures out which one of us is more useful to him. Vanessa sank into one of the conference chairs, her perfect composure finally cracking. I don't believe you, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Why would he lie to me? Why would he keep promising to leave you if he had no intention of actually doing it? Because Derek is a liar, I said simply. It's what he does. He lied to me about money, about business, about you. Why would you be any different? I sat down across from her now, leaning forward. Tell me something, Vanessa. Do you know what Derek does for a living? Like really does, not just the story he's told you. Vanessa looked confused by the question. He's in commercial real estate. He works with Marcus on property development deals. Did he tell you how he makes his money on those deals? I pressed. Did he mention that he falsifies zoning documents? That he takes kickbacks from contractors? That he's displaced low-income families so he can build luxury condos and pocket the difference? Vanessa's eyes widened. That's not, Derek wouldn't, he would and he did, I interrupted. His own father documented everything before he died. There are photographs, bank records, emails. Derek is a fraud, Vanessa. And not just in business. In everything. In his marriage, in his affair with you, in his entire life. He's a fraud. I pulled out a folder I'd brought with me, not Thomas's original documents, I wasn't stupid enough to risk those, but copies of some of the most damning evidence. Property deals where Derek had lied about zoning. Text messages between him and contractors discussing under-the-table payments. Records of families who'd been evicted so Derek's developments could move forward. I spread them across the conference table like a royal flush. This is who you're sleeping with, I said. This is the man you've been planning a future with. A criminal who destroys people's lives for profit. Vanessa stared at the documents, her hands shaking as she picked up one page, then another. I could see her mind working, connecting dots, remembering things Derek had said or done that suddenly made sense in this new context. Marcus, she whispered. Marcus must know. They're business partners. Marcus absolutely knows, I confirmed. Which means you work for someone who's complicit in all of this. Which means if Derek goes down, and he will go down, Marcus is going with him. And anyone associated with their firm is going to be tainted by the scandal. I let that sink in for a moment. Vanessa had worked hard to build her career, to rise to senior management at a young age. She'd invested years in this firm, in her professional reputation. And now I was telling her it was all about to implode because she'd fallen for the wrong man. What do you want from me? Vanessa asked finally, looking up at me with tears in her eyes. For the first time since I'd walked into this room, I felt something like sympathy for her. She was a victim too, in her own way, not like me, not with the same depth of betrayal, but Derek had lied to her just as thoroughly as he'd lied to me. I want you to do the right thing, I said. I want you to end this affair, cut all contact with Derek, and when the investigation starts, because it will start, I want you to cooperate fully. Tell the truth about what you know, what Derek told you, what Marcus told you. Don't go down with them out of some misplaced sense of loyalty. Vanessa wiped her eyes, smearing her mascara. And if I don't? I leaned back in my chair, my voice hardening. Then I'll make sure everyone knows about your role in all of this. Your family, your professional network, everyone. I have documentation of your affair, photographs, hotel records, text messages. I can make your life very uncomfortable, Vanessa. Or you can walk away clean, find a new job, start over. Your choice. It was a bluff, mostly. I didn't actually care about ruining Vanessa's life. She wasn't my target, Derek was. But she didn't know that, and the threat was enough to make her consider her options. I need time to think, Vanessa said quietly. You have until tomorrow, I said, standing up. After that, things are going to start moving very fast, and you'll want to be on the right side when they do. I gathered up the documents and put them back in my folder. At the door, I paused and looked back at her. For what it's worth, I said, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you fell for a very good liar. But that doesn't excuse what you did. You knew Derek was married. You chose to pursue him anyway. That's on you. Vanessa didn't respond, just sat there looking destroyed in her expensive dress in that corporate conference room. I walked out feeling both triumphant and empty. I'd done what I came to do. I'd shaken Vanessa's faith in Derek, planted the seeds of doubt, given her a way out. But it didn't feel as satisfying as I'd hoped. Because the truth was, Vanessa wasn't really my enemy. She was just another woman who'd believed Derek's lies, just another casualty of his selfishness. The real enemy was Derek himself, and he still didn't know what was coming for him. I was halfway back to my car when my phone rang. It was Margaret. Grace, she said, her voice tight. We need to talk. Derek just called me. He's trying to borrow money from Caroline. He's panicking about the deadline, getting desperate. I think we need to move up our timeline. My heart started racing. What do you mean? I mean I've made my decision about whether to expose Derek or protect him, Margaret said. And I want you to be there when I tell him. Can you come to my house tonight? 7 o'clock. This was it. This was the moment everything would start falling apart for Derek, and it was happening 3 weeks earlier than I'd planned. I'll be there, I said. Margaret, what did you decide? There was a long pause. Then, you'll find out tonight. Bring your evidence. All of it. Let's end this. She hung up before I could ask anything else. I stood in the parking lot, my mind racing. If Margaret was ready to make her choice tonight, I needed to be ready too. I needed to have everything in order, the divorce papers, the fraud documentation, all of Thomas's evidence. I needed to be prepared for Derek's reaction, for the fallout, for everything that would come next. I called Shanice. It's happening tonight, I said. Margaret's calling Derek to her house. She's going to tell him her decision, and she wants me there. Oh shit, Shanice breathed. Are you ready for this? I don't know, I admitted. But it doesn't matter. It's happening whether I'm ready or not. You want me to come with you? Shanice offered. I thought about it, but shook my head even though she couldn't see me. No. This is family business. But can you be on standby? In case I need to leave quickly or need somewhere to go after. Always, Shanice said firmly. Call me if you need anything. And Grace, you've got this. You're stronger than you know. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I made copies of everything, all of Thomas's evidence, all of Patricia's divorce papers, all of my own documentation of Derek's continued affair with Vanessa. I organized it into a presentation binder, the kind I used at work when I needed to make a compelling case to donors or government officials. If this was going to be Derek's reckoning, I wanted it to be thorough. At 6:45, I drove to Margaret's house in Lake Oswego. Derek's car was already in the driveway, a black BMW that suddenly seemed like such a cliché. The car of a man trying to look more successful than he actually was, living beyond his means, faking it until he made it. Or until he crashed and burned. I sat in my car for a few minutes, gathering my courage. Then I grabbed my binder and walked to the door. Margaret answered immediately, like she'd been watching for me. She looked different than she had at the funeral. Harder, more resolved, like she'd finally made peace with something difficult. Grace, she said, stepping aside to let me in. Derek's in the study. He doesn't know you're coming. Does he know why you called him here? I asked. Margaret's smile was grim. He thinks I'm going to give him more time on the debt. He thinks I'm going to save him, the way I always have. He's about to learn otherwise. We walked down the hallway to Thomas's study, a room I'd only been in a handful of times, lined with law books and file cabinets, smelling of leather and old paper. Derek was standing by the window, his back to us, and when he heard us enter, he turned around. The hope on his face when he saw his mother turned to shock when he saw me. "Grace," he said, looking between us in confusion. "What are you doing here?" "I invited her," Margaret said crisply. "Sit down, Derek. We need to have a conversation about your father's will and your future." Derek sat down slowly in one of the leather chairs, his face going pale. I sat in the other chair, and Margaret remained standing, positioned behind Thomas's massive desk like a judge about to deliver a verdict. "Mom," Derek started, "if this is about the money, I'm working on it. I've got some leads on selling some properties, and Marcus thinks we can—" "Stop," Margaret interrupted. "Just stop talking, Derek. I'm going to speak, and you're going to listen. Can you do that?" Derek nodded, looking like a little boy being scolded by his mother. It might have been funny if the situation weren't so serious. Margaret opened a drawer in Thomas's desk and pulled out the manila folder she'd shown me before, the one with all of Thomas's documentation. She set it on the desk with a heavy thump. "Your father left you an ultimatum," she said. "Pay back the debt within 30 days, or be exposed." He gave me the power to decide whether to enforce that ultimatum or let you walk away clean. I've spent the past 2 weeks trying to decide what to do, trying to figure out what Thomas would have wanted, what's best for you, what's best for this family. She paused, her grey eyes boring into Derek. "I've made my decision." The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Derek was frozen in his chair, barely breathing. "I'm not going to protect you anymore," Margaret said, and her voice was like steel. "I'm not going to forgive the debt. I'm not going to hide your crimes or make excuses for your behavior. Your father was right. You need to face real consequences, or you'll never change. So here's what's going to happen." She picked up the folder and held it up. "Tomorrow morning, I'm sending all of this documentation to the IRS, to the Oregon State Bar, and to a journalist friend of your father's who specializes in white-collar crime. You have about 24 hours before your entire life implodes." Derek's face went white. "Mom, you can't do that. That's your son. That's your family. If this gets out, it'll destroy all of us." "No," Margaret said firmly. "It'll destroy you. Caroline and I will be fine. We'll weather the scandal. But you, Derek, you're going to lose everything. Your license, your career, probably your freedom when the criminal investigation starts. And you'll deserve every bit of it." Derek turned to me, desperation in his eyes. "Grace, please. Tell her she's wrong. Tell her we can work through this together. Tell her, I filed for divorce yesterday," I said calmly, and I watched Derek's face crumble. "I'm divorcing you on grounds of adultery and fraud. I have evidence of your affair with Vanessa Park, including photographs from this week. I have documentation of all your illegal business dealings. And I've given all of it to my attorney, who will be serving you with papers tomorrow morning." Derek made a sound like he'd been punched. You talked to Vanessa?" "This morning," I confirmed. "Had a lovely chat about how you've been lying to both of us, promising each of us different futures, playing us against each other. She was very surprised to learn that you told me I was the most important thing in your life just 3 days ago. She's ending things with you, by the way. In case you were wondering." Derek stood up abruptly, his chair falling backward with a crash. "This isn't happening," he said, his voice rising. "This can't be happening. Mom, Grace, please, we're family. We can work this out. I'll pay back the money, I'll go to therapy, I'll do anything." "It's too late for that," I said, standing up too. I opened my binder and started laying out documents on Thomas's desk. This is the paperwork documenting your fraud. This is evidence of your affair. These are statements from families who lost their homes because of your illegal deals. This is a timeline of every lie you've told me over the past 3 years. And this, I pulled out the last document, the one I'd been saving. This is a statement I got yesterday from one of your former clients, a woman named Rosa Martinez. Remember her? Single mother of 3 who lost her apartment when your development bought her building? She's willing to testify about how you personally told her the property wasn't being rezoned 2 weeks before she got her eviction notice. That's fraud, Derek. That's a crime with real victims. Derek was shaking now, his face red, his hands clenched into fists. For a moment, I thought he might actually hit something, or someone. But then he just collapsed back into his chair and put his face in his hands. I'm so sorry, he sobbed. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I just wanted to be successful. I just wanted to make enough money that we could have the life we deserved. I did it for us, Grace. For our future. No, I said coldly. You did it for yourself. You did it because you're selfish and weak and you couldn't stand the idea of actually working hard for success. You took shortcuts, you lied, you cheated, and you hurt people who couldn't fight back. And you did it while I was working 60-hour weeks trying to help people, trying to make the world better. You're not the man I thought I married, Derek. You're not even close. Margaret watched this exchange with a stony expression. When Derek's sobs finally subsided into hiccuping breaths, she spoke again. You need to leave now, she said. Leave this house, leave Grace alone, and find yourself a good criminal attorney. You're going to need one. Derek looked up at his mother, his face streaked with tears. Mom, please, go, Margaret said, pointing to the door. And Derek, don't call me. Don't come by. Not until you're ready to actually face what you've done and take responsibility for it. I'll still be your mother, but I won't be your enabler anymore. Derek stood up slowly, looking between his mother and me like he couldn't believe this was really happening. Then he walked out of the study, out of the house, and a few moments later, we heard his car start and drive away. The silence he left behind was enormous. I sank back into my chair, suddenly exhausted. The confrontation I'd been building toward for weeks was over, and I felt nothing. Just a vast emptiness where my marriage used to be. Are you all right? Margaret asked, and there was genuine concern in her voice. I laughed, a hollow sound. I don't know. I don't know what I am anymore. Margaret came around the desk and, in a move that shocked me, put her hand on my shoulder. You're free, she said quietly. That's what you are. Free from his lies, free from his manipulation, free to build whatever life you want now. I looked up at her, this woman who'd never liked me, who'd always looked at me with barely concealed disapproval. Why did you change your mind? I asked. About protecting Derek. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Because I realized that protecting him wasn't love, she said finally. It was fear. Fear of scandal, fear of judgment, fear of admitting that Thomas and I had failed as parents. But letting him face consequences, that's the loving thing to do. That's what might actually save him in the long run. She squeezed my shoulder once, then stepped back. You're stronger than I gave you credit for, Grace. I'm sorry I underestimated you. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get from Margaret Calloway, and I took it. We spent the next hour going through the plan for tomorrow. Margaret would send the documentation to the authorities in the morning. I would have Derek served with divorce papers at his hotel, and would let the legal system take over from there. By the time I left Margaret's house, it was almost 10 o'clock. I sat in my car and called Shanice. It's done, I said. We told him. Everything. How did he take it? Shanice asked. About as well as you'd expect, I said. Lots of crying, lots of begging. But Shanice, it's really over. My marriage is over. Derek's career is over. Everything's over. No, Shanice said firmly. Everything's beginning. Your new life starts now, Grace. The life you deserve, without lies and without him. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to feel triumphant, victorious, free. But all I felt was tired. So tired. I'm coming over, Shanice said. You shouldn't be alone tonight. I'm packing a bag and I'll be at your place in 20 minutes. Thank you, I whispered, and tears finally started falling. Not for Derek, not for my marriage, but for everything I'd lost and everything I'd yet to figure out how to rebuild. The next morning, Portland woke up to a beautiful spring day, one of those rare March mornings when the sun actually breaks through the clouds and you can almost believe winter is over. I woke up on my couch with Shanice asleep in the armchair across from me, an empty bottle of wine on the coffee table between us. We'd stayed up late talking through everything, crying and laughing and planning what came next. Now, in the harsh light of day, I had to actually follow through on all of it. My phone was already buzzing with messages. Patricia Chen had sent me a text. Server delivered papers to Derek at his hotel at 8:15 a.m. His officially served. Expect retaliation. Margaret had sent an email with receipt confirmations showing that she'd sent Thomas's documentation to the IRS, the Bar Association, and a reporter named James Fitzgerald at the Oregonian. There was no going back now. The machine of justice, or revenge, depending on how you looked at it, was in motion. The first call came at 9:30 a.m. It was Derek, and I let it go to voicemail. Then he called again. And again. By the 10th call, Shanice grabbed my phone and turned it off. You don't need to hear whatever he has to say, she said firmly. Let your lawyer handle him from now on. But I couldn't resist checking the voicemails. Derek's first message was angry. How could you do this to me, Grace? How could you team up with my mother to destroy me? I thought we were working through this. I thought you loved me. The second was desperate. Please, Grace, please call me back. We can fix this. I'll do anything. I'll go to the police myself. I'll turn myself in. Just please don't do this. Please don't leave me. The third was resigned. I got the divorce papers. I can't believe you're really doing this. 8 years, Grace. 8 years together, and you're just throwing it all away. I hope you're happy with yourself. I deleted all of them without listening to the rest. Derek didn't get to make me feel guilty, didn't get to rewrite history and make himself the victim. He'd had 8 years to be honest with me, 8 years to build the marriage we both deserved. He'd chosen to lie instead. This was his consequence, not my cruelty. By noon, the story had broken. James Fitzgerald, the reporter Margaret had contacted, worked fast. The Oregonian's website featured a prominent article, Local Real Estate Developer Under Investigation for Fraud. It detailed Derek's illegal dealings, the falsified zoning documents, the displaced families. It mentioned the IRS investigation and the Bar Association review. It even included a statement from Rosa Martinez, the woman I'd talked to, describing how Derek had lied to her about the rezoning and how she'd lost her home as a result. The article didn't mention the affair. That was personal, not newsworthy, but it was damning enough. Derek's professional reputation was destroyed. Within hours, the story had spread across local news sites and social media. Portland's real estate community was small and gossipy, and everyone knew everyone. Derek's phone must have been exploding with calls from angry clients, concerned colleagues, and former friends suddenly remembering they'd never trusted him. I felt a grim satisfaction reading the comments on the article, people expressing outrage about developers who preyed on vulnerable communities, calling for Derek to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But then I got a call I wasn't expecting. It was Marcus Chen. Grace, he said when I answered, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. We need to talk. I don't think we have anything to discuss, I said coldly. You enabled Derek's fraud. You profited from it. As far as I'm concerned, you're just as guilty as he is. That's not true, Marcus snapped. I didn't know the full extent of what Derek was doing. He kept me in the dark about the falsified documents, the kickbacks, all of it. And now my firm is being investigated because of him. My reputation is being dragged through the mud because of your husband's crimes. Ex-husband, I corrected. Soon to be, anyway. And I'm sorry your business is suffering, Marcus, but you should have been paying closer attention to your partner. You should have asked more questions. There was a pause, then Marcus's voice changed, became calculating. I know about Vanessa, he said. I know Derek was having an affair with one of my employees. I know you confronted her yesterday. If that gets out, if it becomes public, it's going to make everything worse. It's going to look like my firm was covering up an inappropriate relationship along with the fraud. I felt a chill run down my spine. Was Marcus threatening me? What exactly are you suggesting? I asked carefully. I'm suggesting we make a deal, Marcus said. You keep the affair quiet, don't mention Vanessa's name to investigators, don't include it in any public statements. In exchange, I'll make sure Vanessa cooperates fully with the fraud investigation. She knows things about Derek's deals, things that could help prosecutors build a stronger case against him, things that could put him away for a long time. It was tempting. Part of me wanted to expose the affair, wanted everyone to know that Derek hadn't just been a fraud professionally but personally too. But the strategic part of my brain, the part that had been running my non-profit for 6 years, knew that Marcus was right. Keeping the focus on the fraud would make for a cleaner case, would ensure Derek faced real criminal consequences. The affair was just humiliation, the fraud was justice. Fine, I said finally. But I want it in writing that Vanessa will cooperate. I want her statement to investigators, and I want regular updates on what she's telling them. Done, Marcus said quickly. I'll have my attorney draw up a memorandum of understanding. We'll send it to your lawyer today. After I hung up, Shanice looked at me with raised eyebrows. You just made a deal with the devil, she said. Maybe, I admitted. But if it puts Derek in prison, it's worth it. The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls and messages. Patricia Chen called to tell me that Derek's attorney had reached out, asking for a meeting to discuss the divorce terms. Caroline, Derek's sister, called crying and asking how I could do this to her brother. Friends I hadn't heard from in months suddenly reached out, some offering support, others clearly just fishing for gossip. Through it all, I felt strangely detached, like I was watching everything happen to someone else. This was my life falling apart, my marriage ending, my husband being destroyed, but it didn't feel real. It felt like a play I was watching from the audience, not a drama I was living through. That evening, I made myself dinner, the first real meal I'd cooked since Thomas's funeral, and tried to think about what came next. The divorce would take months to finalize. The criminal investigation would take even longer. I'd have to testify, probably multiple times, reliving Derek's betrayal over and over in front of judges and juries and attorneys. I'd have to watch our joint assets be divided and Derek's assets be seized. I'd have to figure out how to rebuild my life as a single woman in my mid-30s, starting over in every possible way. It was overwhelming. But it was also, in a strange way, freeing. For the first time in years, my life was my own. I didn't have to wonder what Derek was really doing when he said he was working late. I didn't have to second-guess my instincts or feel crazy for suspecting something was wrong. I knew the truth now, all of it, and the truth, as painful as it was, had set me free. If you've made it this far in my story, I want to ask you to do something for me. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who's going through a betrayal, someone who's questioning whether they're strong enough to leave, someone who needs to know that you can survive the worst thing you can imagine and come out the other side. And check the description box below for more stories about survival, strength, and starting over. The following days blurred together into a routine of legal meetings and therapy sessions. Patricia Chen was relentless, building a case for the divorce that would leave Derek with as little as possible. She'd filed motions to freeze Derek's assets, preventing him from hiding money or transferring property to avoid paying me what I was owed. She'd subpoenaed records from his bank accounts, his business dealings, even his personal emails and text messages. Every lie Derek had ever told was being documented, catalogued, prepared for court. The IRS investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within a week, agents had raided Derek's office and seized boxes of documents. They'd interviewed clients, contractors, everyone who'd had business dealings with Derek over the past 5 years. The Bar Association had suspended Derek's real estate license pending their investigation. He couldn't work, couldn't make money, couldn't do anything except watch his life collapse around him. Through mutual friends, I heard that Derek had moved back in with Margaret, a humiliation that must have stung, a grown man crawling back to his mother's house because he had nowhere else to go. I heard he was drinking heavily, barely leaving his room, refusing to talk to anyone except his attorney. Part of me felt sorry for him. A small, stubborn part that remembered the man I'd fallen in love with, the man who'd seemed so confident and capable and full of potential. But mostly, I felt nothing. Or maybe not nothing, maybe I felt satisfied. Satisfied that justice was being done, that Derek was finally facing consequences for his actions, that the families he'd hurt would see him punished. 3 weeks after the story broke, I got a call from Rosa Martinez, the woman who'd lost her apartment because of Derek's fraud. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her accented English soft but determined, "for speaking up, for fighting for us. Nobody ever fights for people like me." "You shouldn't have to fight alone," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "What Derek did to you and your family was wrong. He should never have gotten away with it." "They are charging him," Rosa said. "The prosecutor called me yesterday. They're charging him with fraud, racketeering, a bunch of things I don't even understand. They said he could go to prison for years." The word prison hung in the air between us. Derek, my husband, the man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years, was going to prison. It was what I'd wanted, what I'd worked toward, but hearing it said out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "How do you feel about that?" Rosa asked gently. "I don't know," I admitted. "I wanted him to pay for what he did. But I never thought it would go this far." "My daughter asked me if I was happy," Rosa said. "When I told her they were prosecuting the man who made us lose our home. I told her no, I'm not happy. I'm relieved. There's a difference." She was right. Relief was the right word. Not happiness, not satisfaction, not triumph. Just relief that the truth was out, that Derek couldn't hurt anyone else, that justice was finally being done. A month after everything exploded, I had my first real breakdown. It happened in the middle of a perfectly normal day. I was at work, sitting in my office at the nonprofit, reviewing grant applications like I'd done 1,000 times before. And suddenly, I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, my vision went dark around the edges, and I felt like I was drowning. Shanice found me hyperventilating in the bathroom, mascara running down my face, completely falling apart. She took me home, held me while I cried, and finally admitted what I'd been denying for weeks: I wasn't okay. I wasn't handling this as well as I thought I was. The strength I'd been projecting was a mask, and underneath it, I was shattered. "You need to talk to someone," Shanice said firmly. "A real therapist, not just me. You've been through trauma, Grace. You don't just bounce back from that." She was right, of course. I'd been so focused on destroying Derek, on getting revenge, on making sure he paid for what he'd done, that I hadn't dealt with my own pain. I hadn't processed the betrayal, the loss, the grief of watching my marriage die. I just pushed it all down and kept moving forward, kept fighting, kept working. But you can only run on rage and adrenaline for so long before your body forces you to stop. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Sarah Kim the following week. She was patient and kind and didn't judge me when I admitted that part of me felt guilty for destroying Derek's life, even though he absolutely deserved it. "Revenge doesn't always feel the way we think it will," Dr. Kim said during one of our sessions. "We imagine it will be satisfying, cathartic. But often, it just leaves us feeling empty. Because revenge doesn't heal the wound, it just proves that the wound existed." Her words stayed with me. Because she was right, I didn't feel healed. I felt vindicated, justified, proven right. But I didn't feel whole. The part of me that Derek had broken with his lies was still broken, and no amount of legal victories or criminal charges would fix it. That was work I had to do myself, slowly and painfully, one therapy session at a time. But even as I struggled with my own healing, the legal machine kept grinding forward. Derek's trial was set for September, 6 months away. The prosecutor's office had built a case they described as overwhelming. Dozens of witnesses, hundreds of documents, testimony from families Derek had hurt and contractors he'd bribed. Derek's attorney had tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor wasn't interested. They wanted to make an example of him, wanted to send a message that white-collar crime had real consequences. As summer arrived and Portland bloomed into its beautiful, brief summer season, I started to feel like maybe I could breathe again. The divorce was moving forward. Derek had contested nothing, had signed everything Patricia put in front of him with the defeated resignation of a man who'd given up. Our house had sold, and I'd found a small apartment in southeast Portland, nothing fancy but mine. All mine. No shared spaces, no memories of Derek, no ghosts of the life we'd pretended to build together. I went on a few dates, half-hearted attempts that went nowhere because I wasn't ready. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects at the non-profit, finding purpose in helping people the way I always had. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected during my marriage, built a life that was fuller and richer than the one I'd left behind. And through it all, I waited. Waited for Derek's trial, waited for the final divorce decree, waited for the closure that everyone kept telling me would come eventually. But before that closure arrived, something happened that changed everything again. Something that made me realize that revenge, no matter how justified, always has a cost. And sometimes, that cost is higher than you ever imagined. It was mid-August, 2 weeks before Derek's trial was set to begin, when I got the call from Margaret. Her voice was strained in a way I'd never heard before, and my first thought was that something had happened to Caroline or one of Margaret's grandchildren. "Grace," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "It's Derek. He's in the hospital. He tried to kill himself." The world stopped. Everything, the traffic noise outside my apartment, the email I'd been writing, my own heartbeat, just stopped. "What?" I whispered. "He took pills," Margaret said, her words coming out in a rush. "Sleeping pills, pain medication, everything in his bathroom cabinet. Caroline found him this morning when she went to check on him. He left a note." My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. Is he going to be okay?" "They pumped his stomach. He's stable now, physically. But Grace, he's on psychiatric hold. They think," her voice broke, "they think he'll try again if they release him." I sat down heavily, my legs suddenly unable to hold me. Derek had tried to kill himself. The man I'd been married to for 8 years, the man I'd loved and hated and destroyed, had tried to end his own life. "The note," I heard myself ask. "What did it say?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "He said he couldn't live with what he'd done. To you, to the families he'd hurt, to all of us. He said he deserved to die, that the world would be better off without him." She paused, then added quietly, "He asked for you, Grace. He's asking to see you." The request hit me like a physical blow. After everything, after the lies, the betrayal, the affair, the fraud, Derek wanted to see me. Wanted me to come to his hospital bed and what? Forgive him? Tell him it was okay? Hold his hand while he faced the consequences of his own actions? "I can't," I said immediately. "Margaret, I can't see him. I'm sorry, but I can't." "I understand," Margaret said, and she did sound like she understood. "But Grace, I think you should know something else. The prosecutor called me this morning. If Derek isn't mentally competent to stand trial, they might have to postpone. Or drop the charges altogether. His suicide attempt might be the thing that saves him from prison." The irony was devastating. Derek had tried to escape his consequences through death, and instead, he might escape them through psychiatric intervention. All the work I'd done, all the evidence I'd gathered, all the pain I'd endured, it might all be for nothing because Derek was too weak to face what he'd done. What do you want me to do? I asked Margaret. She let out a long breath. I don't know. I'm his mother, so I have to care about whether he lives or dies. But I'm also Thomas's widow, and I made a promise to let Derek face justice. I'm torn, Grace. I don't know what the right thing is anymore. Neither did I. I got off the phone and sat in my apartment, staring at the wall, trying to process what I was feeling. Was I glad Derek had survived? Yes. Did I want him to die? No, of course not. But was I sympathetic to his pain? That was harder to answer. Part of me, the part that had loved him, that remembered our good times, that had once believed we'd grow old together, felt a stab of concern. Derek was suffering so much that he'd tried to end his life. That was real pain, real desperation. But the other part of me, the part that had been betrayed, lied to, humiliated, felt something colder. Derek had made his choices. He'd lied, cheated, defrauded innocent people, destroyed lives for profit. Now he was facing consequences, and instead of handling them with dignity, he was trying to escape through suicide. It felt like one more act of cowardice, one more way of avoiding responsibility. I called Dr. Kim, my therapist, and she agreed to see me for an emergency session that evening. How do you feel about Derek's suicide attempt? She asked me, sitting in her comfortable office with the soft lighting that was supposed to make people feel safe enough to be honest. I don't know, I admitted. I feel guilty, like maybe I pushed him too hard. But I also feel angry, like he's still trying to manipulate the situation, still trying to make himself the victim. Dr. Kim nodded. Both of those feelings can be true at the same time. Derek made choices that hurt people, including you. You chose to hold him accountable. His response to that accountability, his inability to cope with consequences, that's not your responsibility. But if he'd succeeded, I said, my voice breaking. If he'd actually died, I would have been the one who killed him. Not directly, but my actions led to this. I destroyed his life. Derek destroyed his own life, Dr. Kim said firmly. You exposed the truth. There's a difference. Derek had years to come clean, years to make better choices, years to actually fix the problems he'd created. He chose not to. He chose to keep lying, keep cheating, keep hurting people. The fact that he couldn't handle the consequences when they finally arrived doesn't make those consequences wrong or unjust. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to feel okay about what I'd done, about the revenge I'd taken, about the justice I'd pursued. But sitting in that therapist's office, I felt the weight of it all crashing down on me. Revenge had a cost, and I was paying it. He wants to see me, I told Dr. Kim. Should I go? She considered the question carefully. That depends on what you hope to get out of it. Would seeing Derek help you heal? Or would it just reopen wounds that are trying to close? I thought about it for a long time. What did I want from Derek? An apology. He'd already given me dozens of those, none of them sincere enough to matter. Closure. I wasn't sure Derek could give me that. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted from him anymore. The man I'd been married to felt like a stranger now, someone I'd never really known at all. I don't think I should see him, I said finally. I don't think it would help either of us. Dr. Kim nodded approvingly. That's a healthy boundary. You're allowed to protect yourself, Grace. You're allowed to say no, even to someone who's in pain. But saying no and feeling okay about saying no were two different things. Over the next few days, as word spread about Derek's suicide attempt, I felt the judgment from people who didn't know the whole story. I overheard co-workers whispering about how I must have pushed him too hard, how maybe I should have been more forgiving. I got a few pointed Facebook messages from Derek's friends, people I'd thought were my friends too, accusing me of cruelty, of taking revenge too far. Even Caroline called me, crying and angry. He almost died, Grace, she said. My brother almost died because you couldn't just let things go. You had to destroy him completely. Are you happy now? No, I said honestly. I'm not happy. But Caroline, Derek didn't almost die because of me. He almost died because he couldn't face what he'd done. He hurt people. Real people, with real lives. Your brother displaced families, took bribes, broke the law. And when he got caught, he chose pills instead of accountability. That's on him, not me. Caroline hung up on me, and we haven't spoken since. I lost several friendships in those weeks, people who decided I was the villain in this story, that I'd taken my revenge too far. It hurt more than I'd expected. I'd thought that being right, being justified, would be enough. But it wasn't. Because even when you're right, even when justice is on your side, you still lose things. You still pay a price. Shanice was the one person who never wavered. Don't let them make you the bad guy, she said fiercely when I told her about the judgment I was facing. You didn't almost kill Derek. Derek almost killed Derek. You just stopped letting him get away with murder, metaphorically speaking. She was right, but it was hard to remember that when people were looking at me like I was a monster. The prosecutor's office called me in for a meeting 2 weeks after Derek's suicide attempt. They wanted to discuss how his mental state would affect the trial. The defense is going to argue that Derek isn't competent to stand trial, the lead prosecutor, a woman named Jennifer Walsh, told me. They'll say he's suicidal, depressed, unable to participate in his own defense. The judge might order a psychiatric evaluation that could delay the trial for months. So he might get away with it? I asked, feeling that familiar rage building in my chest again. After everything, he might just walk free because he took some pills. Not walk free, Jennifer corrected. But the trial might be delayed. And if a psychiatrist determines that Derek is genuinely mentally ill, not just facing normal consequences-related stress, he might end up in a psychiatric facility instead of prison. It's still a consequence, but it's not the same as a criminal conviction. I thought about Rosa Martinez and all the other families Derek had hurt. I thought about Thomas's careful documentation, Margaret's decision to stop protecting her son, my own months of pain and planning. All of it might end with Derek in a comfortable hospital instead of prison. What can I do? I asked. Jennifer looked at me carefully. Honestly, nothing. This is out of your hands now, Grace. The legal system has to run its course. All you can do is testify when the time comes, if the time comes, and tell the truth about what Derek did. The rest is up to judges and juries and psychiatrists. It was the answer I'd been dreading. I'd spent months trying to control this situation, trying to ensure that Derek faced real consequences. But now, I had to let go. I had to trust a system that I knew was flawed, that I knew might fail to deliver the justice I'd been fighting for. The psychiatric evaluation took 3 weeks. During that time, Derek remained in the hospital under observation. I didn't visit, didn't call, didn't send messages. I maintained my boundaries, protected my own mental health, and tried to focus on rebuilding my life. My divorce was finalized in early September, on what would have been our 9th wedding anniversary, a coincidence so bitter I almost laughed when I realized it. Grace Sullivan again. No longer Grace Calloway. Single, 34 years old, starting over. The divorce settlement was surprisingly straightforward. Derek had no assets left to fight over. Everything had been seized by the IRS or was being held pending the criminal case. I got the furniture from our house, my car, my personal savings. Derek got nothing, because he had nothing left to get. When I walked out of the courthouse with my divorce decree in hand, I thought I'd feel triumphant. Instead, I just felt tired. Tired of fighting, tired of being angry, tired of the whole exhausting process of revenge and justice and consequence. Patricia Chen hugged me in the parking lot. You did it, she said. You're free. But I didn't feel free. I felt like I was dragging the weight of the past year behind me like chains, like I'd never really be free of Derek and what we'd done to each other. The results of Derek's psychiatric evaluation came back in late September. I was at work when Jennifer Walsh called to tell me the findings. The psychiatrist determined that Derek is suffering from severe depression and has active suicidal ideation, she said. But is also determined to be competent to stand trial. The suicide attempt was assessed as a response to stress and consequence, not evidence of a mental illness that would preclude him from understanding the charges against him. Relief flooded through me. So the trial is still happening? Yes, Jennifer confirmed. We're looking at an October start date now. Grace, I need you to be prepared for this. The defense is going to try to use Derek's mental state to generate sympathy. They're going to paint him as a man who made mistakes but who's suffered enough. You're going to have to testify, and they're going to cross-examine you about your role in exposing him, about whether you acted out of justice or revenge. It's not going to be pleasant. I can handle it, I said, and I meant it. I'd come this far. I could make it through a trial. But before the trial could begin, something happened that I never could have anticipated. Something that made me question everything I'd done, every choice I'd made, every act of revenge I'd pursued. Because that's the thing about revenge. You never know where it's going to lead. You never know what collateral damage you're going to cause. And sometimes, by the time you realize the cost, it's too late to take any of it back. The Multnomah County Courthouse is an imposing building in downtown Portland, all stone columns and marble floors, the kind of place designed to make you feel the weight of justice. I walked through those doors on the first day of October, exactly 6 months after Thomas Calloway's funeral, and I felt like I was stepping into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The trial of Oregon versus Derek Calloway had finally begun, and I was the prosecution's star witness. The courtroom was packed. I recognized some of Derek's former clients, people he'd cheated or lied to over the years. Rosa Martinez was there with her daughter, both of them dressed in their Sunday best. Margaret sat in the back row, her face impassive, while Caroline sat on Derek's side of the room, glaring at me with undisguised hatred. And Derek sat at the defense table in a grey suit that hung loosely on his frame. He'd lost weight, a lot of it. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and when he looked at me, I saw nothing. No anger, no love, no recognition. Just emptiness. Jennifer Walsh had prepared me thoroughly for this moment. She'd walked me through what questions she'd ask, what the defense would likely attack, how to stay calm under cross-examination. Tell the truth, she'd said. Don't embellish, don't get emotional, just tell the truth. That's all we need from you. The trial started with opening statements. Jennifer laid out the case methodically, Derek's pattern of fraud, the falsified documents, the bribes, the families who'd been hurt. She showed photographs of the apartment building where Rosa Martinez had lived, the luxury condos that had been built in its place, the paper trail of Derek's profits. Derek's attorney, a slick defense lawyer named Robert Morrison, painted a different picture. He talked about a man who'd made mistakes, yes, but who'd been driven by desperation, by debt to his own father, by the pressure to succeed in a competitive industry. He talked about Derek's remorse, his suicide attempt, his complete breakdown as evidence that he'd already been punished beyond what the law required. My client is not a monster, Morrison said, looking directly at the jury. He's a man who made bad choices and who has paid a terrible price for those choices. The question you have to ask yourselves is, how much punishment is enough? It was a compelling argument, I had to admit. And when I looked at the jury, 12 Portlanders of various ages and backgrounds, I couldn't tell which narrative they were buying. On the second day of the trial, I was called to testify. I walked to the witness stand on shaking legs, raised my right hand, and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Then I sat down and looked out at the courtroom full of people watching me, judging me, waiting to hear my story. Jennifer started with easy questions. My name, my age, how long I'd been married to Derek. Then she moved into more difficult territory, when I discovered Derek's fraud, what evidence I'd found, how Thomas had documented everything. I answered carefully, sticking to facts, trying not to let emotion creep into my voice. But then Jennifer asked the question I'd been dreading. Mrs. Sullivan, when you discovered your husband's crimes, why did you decide to go to the authorities rather than handling it privately? I took a breath. Because Derek's fraud hurt real people, I said. He displaced families from their homes. He lied to vulnerable people so he could make a profit. That's not a private matter, that's a crime that deserved to be prosecuted. And did you have any other motivation for exposing your husband? Jennifer asked. This was the dangerous part. The part where I had to be honest about my own role without making myself look vindictive. I was angry, I admitted. I'd been lied to for years. I'd built my life around a marriage that wasn't real. So yes, I wanted Derek to face consequences. But that doesn't change the fact that what he did was wrong and illegal. Jennifer nodded, satisfied, and handed me over to the defense for cross-examination. Robert Morrison approached the witness stand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was going to try to destroy me, to make me look like a vengeful ex-wife who'd gone too far. I could see it in the way he moved, the way he positioned himself between me and the jury. "Mrs. Sullivan," he began, "you say you were motivated by justice. But isn't it true that you were also motivated by revenge?" "I was motivated by both," I said honestly. "I wanted justice for the families Derek hurt, and I wanted him to face consequences for lying to me. Those things aren't mutually exclusive." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "So you admit you wanted revenge?" "I wanted accountability," I corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Morrison challenged. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you systematically destroyed my client's life. You exposed his affair, you turned his own mother against him, you coordinated with prosecutors to build a case against him. That sounds like revenge to me." I felt my temper rising but forced myself to stay calm. "Your client destroyed his own life," I said evenly. "I just stopped covering for him. I stopped pretending everything was fine. I stopped being complicit in his lies." Morrison pounced on that. "Complicit? So you're saying you knew about Derek's illegal activities and chose not to report them until you wanted to hurt him?" "No," I said firmly. "I didn't know about the illegal activities until after his father died. Thomas Calloway documented everything and left it for Derek to find. When I discovered what Derek had done, I had a choice: protect him or do the right thing. I chose to do the right thing." "The right thing," Morrison repeated skeptically. "Even though your actions drove your husband to attempt suicide." The courtroom went silent. This was the moment Morrison had been building toward, the accusation he wanted the jury to hear. "Derek's suicide attempt was his choice," I said, and my voice was shaking now but still strong. "I didn't hand him those pills. I didn't tell him to take them. I exposed his crimes and filed for divorce. Those are legal, appropriate responses to discovering fraud and infidelity. Derek's inability to handle the consequences of his own actions is not my responsibility." Morrison stared at me for a long moment, then switched tactics. "Let's talk about timing," he said. "You discovered Derek's crimes in early spring. His father's deadline was 30 days. But you waited, you planned, you coordinated with prosecutors, you timed your divorce filing for maximum impact. Doesn't that sound like someone who was more interested in causing pain than in pursuing justice?" "I was interested in building a strong case," I said. "I was interested in making sure Derek couldn't hide evidence or flee or find some way to escape consequences. If that's causing pain, then so be it. But the pain Derek felt was from facing what he'd done, not from anything I did to him." Morrison asked a few more questions, trying to shake my testimony, but I held firm. When he finally dismissed me, I walked back to my seat feeling exhausted but satisfied. I'd told my truth. Now it was up to the jury to decide what to do with it. Over the next 2 weeks, the prosecution paraded witness after witness. Rosa Martinez testified about losing her home, about her children having to change schools, about the stress and trauma of sudden displacement. Other families told similar stories. Contractors testified about Derek offering them under-the-table payments in exchange for falsified inspection reports. An accountant detailed the money trail, showing exactly how much profit Derek had made from his fraudulent deals. The defense tried to minimize each testimony, to paint Derek as a small player in a larger corrupt system, as someone who'd just been following industry norms. But the evidence was overwhelming. Thomas Calloway's documentation was thorough and damning. Even Morrison's skilled defense couldn't explain away the stack of falsified documents, the recorded bribes, the trail of victims. Then came the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating. Derek took the stand in his own defense. He looked even worse than he had at the beginning of the trial. Thinner, paler, like a ghost of the man I'd married. Morrison led him through a carefully crafted narrative. Derek admitted to his crimes but framed them as desperate acts by a man drowning in debt. He talked about the pressure from his father, the impossible deadline, the fear of losing everything. He cried when he talked about the families he'd hurt, said he'd never meant to cause harm, that he'd been so focused on survival that he'd lost sight of the human cost. "I know I did terrible things," Derek said, his voice breaking. "I know I hurt people. I hurt my wife, my family, people who trusted me. And I have to live with that every day. I tried," his voice caught. "I tried to make it stop hurting. I tried to end it. But I survived, and now I have to face what I've done. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking for a chance to make things right somehow." It was a compelling performance, and I could see some of the jurors responding to it, sympathy softening their faces. Then Jennifer Walsh stood up for cross-examination, and I watched her dismantle Derek's testimony piece by piece. "Mr. Calloway," she began, "you say you never meant to cause harm. But you falsified documents that directly led to families being evicted. How is that not intentional?" Derek fumbled for an answer. I knew people might be displaced, but I thought there were programs to help them, social services. Did you contact any of those social services?" Jennifer interrupted. "Did you help any of the families find new housing? Did you do anything besides take your profit and move on to the next deal?" "No," Derek admitted quietly. "And your affair with Vanessa Park," Jennifer continued. "That lasted 18 months. You told your wife you loved her, promised her a future together, all while sleeping with another woman. Was that also unintentional?" "That's different," Derek started, but Jennifer cut him off. "Is it? Because it seems to me that you've spent years making intentional choices that benefited you at the expense of others, and now that you're facing consequences, you want us to believe it was all just a series of mistakes. Which is it, Mr. Calloway? Are you a calculating criminal who knew exactly what he was doing? Or are you incompetent and reckless? Because you can't be both." Derek had no answer for that. He sat on the stand looking destroyed, and when Morrison finally called for a recess, Derek practically fled from the witness box. The trial lasted another week. More witnesses, more testimony, more evidence piled on top of evidence until it felt like we'd all drown in it. Finally, on a grey October afternoon, the jury was sent to deliberate. The wait was agonizing. Hours stretched into a day, then 2 days. The longer they took, the more nervous Jennifer Walsh became. "A quick verdict usually favors the prosecution," she told me during one of our check-ins. "But a long deliberation means they're actually considering the defense's arguments. It could go either way." I spent those 2 days in a fog, unable to work, unable to think about anything except 12 strangers in a room deciding Derek's fate. Deciding, in some ways, whether everything I'd done had been worth it. On the afternoon of the second day, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. We all rushed back to the courthouse. Me, Margaret, Rosa Martinez, and the other victims, Caroline with her red-rimmed eyes, and Derek looking like he might collapse. The jury filed in, and I tried to read their faces, but they gave nothing away. The judge asked the forewoman if they'd reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor," she said, standing. "On the count of fraud in the first degree, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the count of racketeering?" "Guilty." One by one, the forewoman read out the verdict on each of the 12 counts Derek had been charged with. "Guilty. Guilty. Guilty." Every single one. I watched Derek's face crumble, watched him put his head in his hands, watched Morrison put a hand on his shoulder in a gesture that was probably meant to be comforting but just looked defeated. The courtroom erupted in noise, Rosa Martinez crying with relief, Caroline sobbing, reporters rushing for the doors to file their stories. I just sat there feeling nothing. Empty. Vindicated, yes, but also hollow. This was what I'd wanted. This was justice. Derek was guilty, officially and legally. He was going to prison. He was going to pay for what he'd done. But I didn't feel the triumph I'd expected. I just felt tired. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Derek was remanded to custody immediately, led out of the courtroom in handcuffs while Caroline screamed that this was all my fault, that I'd killed her brother. Margaret sat silent through it all, her face unreadable. Outside the courthouse, Jennifer Walsh gave a statement to the press about justice being served and consequences for white-collar crime. Rosa Martinez stood beside her, talking about closure and relief. And I stood off to the side, avoiding cameras, just wanting to go home. But before I could escape, Margaret found me. "Grace," she said quietly, "I want you to know something. Thomas would be proud of you. Proud that you had the courage to do what he started. Proud that you didn't let Derek escape consequences." I didn't know what to say to that. Was I supposed to be proud too? Was I supposed to feel good about putting my ex-husband in prison? "I need to ask you something," I said instead. "Do you regret it? Turning Derek in? Exposing him?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I regret that it had to happen," she said finally. "I regret that my son became the kind of man who needed to be exposed. But no, I don't regret doing it. Derek needed to face what he'd done. It was the only way he might ever become the person he was supposed to be." She walked away then, leaving me standing on the courthouse steps as a light rain began to fall, typical Portland October weather. I tilted my face up to it, letting the cold drops wash over me, and I tried to figure out how I felt about everything that had just happened. The answer, I realized, was complicated. I felt relieved. I felt sad. I felt angry. I felt guilty. I felt vindicated. I felt every emotion simultaneously, a swirling chaos in my chest that threatened to overwhelm me. But mostly, I felt ready for this chapter to close. Ready to stop being the woman who destroyed her husband and start being just Grace again. Whatever that meant now. The 3 weeks between Derek's conviction and his sentencing felt like I was living in suspended animation. Everyone around me seemed to think I should be celebrating. Justice had been served, Derek was going to prison, I'd won. But winning felt a lot like losing, and I couldn't seem to explain that to anyone who hadn't walked in my shoes. I went through the motions of normal life. Work, therapy sessions with Dr. Kim, dinners with Shanice, evenings alone in my apartment watching Netflix and trying not to think about the man I'd once loved sitting in a jail cell waiting to learn how many years of his life he'd lose. Dr. Kim said I was experiencing complicated grief, mourning not the man Derek actually was but the man I'd thought he was, the future would never have, the innocence I'd lost when I discovered that love and trust weren't always enough. "You did the right thing," Dr. Kim assured me in one session. "But doing the right thing doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it just feels necessary." That was exactly it. Necessary but not good. Like amputating a diseased limb to save your life. Necessary, but traumatic. Life-saving, but scarring. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for late October, on a Thursday morning that dawned cold and grey. I woke up in my apartment with a knot in my stomach, knowing that today would be the final chapter of this long, ugly story. Today, a judge would decide how many years Derek would spend in prison, and today, I would finally be able to move forward with my life. I dressed carefully, a black pantsuit, minimal jewelry, my hair pulled back in a professional bun. I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. I'd lost weight too over the past 7 months, the stress and pain whittling away at me until I was sharper, harder than I'd ever been before. I looked older, more severe. I looked like someone who'd been through a war. Shanice met me outside the courthouse, bundled in a thick coat against the October chill. "You ready for this?" she asked, squeezing my hand. "No," I admitted. "But let's do it anyway." The courtroom was less packed than it had been during the trial. Just the key players, Jennifer Walsh and her team, Robert Morrison and his associates, Margaret sitting alone in the back row, Caroline had stopped coming after the conviction, and Rosa Martinez with a few of the other victim families. And me, sitting in the middle, right where I could see Derek's face when he learned his fate. Derek was brought in wearing an orange jail jumpsuit that made him look even more diminished. His wrists were shackled, his hair was unkempt, and when he glanced around the courtroom, his eyes skated right over me like I wasn't there. Like I'd become invisible to him, or maybe like looking at me was too painful to bear. Judge Sarah Henderson, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who presided over the trial, entered and we all rose. When we sat back down, she looked directly at Derek with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mr. Calloway," she began, "you've been found guilty of 12 counts of fraud, racketeering, and related crimes. Before I hand down your sentence, I'm going to allow statements from victims and from your counsel. But first, I want you to understand the gravity of what you've done. Your crimes weren't victimless white-collar offenses. Real people lost their homes, their security, their sense of safety in the world. You exploited vulnerable families for profit, and you did it while hiding behind a veneer of respectability. That makes your crimes particularly egregious in this court's view." Derek's head drooped lower with every word. Judge Henderson nodded to Jennifer Walsh. "The prosecution may present victim impact statements." Rosa Martinez went first. She walked to the stand with quiet dignity, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I came to this country 15 years ago with my 3 children, she said. "I worked 2 jobs to afford that apartment, to give my kids a safe place to live. When Mr. Calloway's company bought our building, he personally came to a tenant meeting and told us not to worry, that nothing would change. He looked me in the eye and lied. 3 months later, we were evicted. My children had to change schools. We lived in a shelter for 6 weeks while I tried to find something we could afford. My oldest daughter started failing her classes because she couldn't concentrate. My youngest son still has nightmares. Mr. Calloway took my family's stability and threw it away so he could make money. I want the court to know that his crimes had real consequences. We are those consequences." She sat down, and I saw several jurors, who'd been brought back for the sentencing, wiping their eyes. 3 more families gave similar statements, each one detailing how Derek's fraud had upended their lives, cost them money they couldn't afford to lose, stolen opportunities and security and peace. Derek kept his head down through all of it, occasionally wiping his face, but he never looked up. Never met anyone's eyes. Then it was the defense's turn. Robert Morrison stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, my client has heard these statements and is genuinely remorseful for the pain he's caused. He's prepared to make restitution to the best of his ability. He's already lost everything: his career, his marriage, his reputation, his mental health. He attempted suicide because the guilt was so overwhelming. The question before this court is not whether Derek Calloway should be punished. He has been and continues to be. The question is whether lengthy incarceration serves any purpose beyond retribution. My client is not a violent criminal. He's not a danger to society. He's a broken man who made terrible mistakes and who will spend the rest of his life trying to atone for them. We ask the court to consider a sentence that includes substantial community service, house arrest, and mandatory mental health treatment rather than years in prison." It was a good argument. Morrison was a skilled attorney, and he positioned Derek as sympathetically as possible given the circumstances. But I could tell from Judge Henderson's expression that she wasn't buying it. "Is there anyone else who wishes to address the court before sentencing?" Judge Henderson asked. I hadn't planned to speak. Jennifer Walsh had asked me if I wanted to give a victim impact statement, but I'd said no. I'd said my piece during the trial. I didn't need to pile on. But something about this moment, about hearing Derek's lawyer try to minimize what he'd done, about the victim's pain hanging in the air, about the 7 months of my own anguish, made me stand up. "Your Honor," I said, and my voice surprised me with its strength. "May I address the court?" Judge Henderson looked at me with interest. "You're the defendant's ex-wife?" "Yes, Your Honor. Grace Sullivan." "You may proceed." I walked to the front of the courtroom on shaking legs. I hadn't prepared anything, didn't have notes or a script. I just had 7 months of accumulated truth that needed to come out. "I was married to Derek Calloway for 8 years, I began. For most of that time, I thought I knew him. I thought he was ambitious but ethical, successful but honest. I built my life around that belief. I trusted him with my future, my finances, my heart. And it was all a lie. I looked at Derek for the first time, and he finally raised his head and met my eyes. There was so much pain in his face that I almost stopped. Almost. But I'd come this far. I had to finish. Derek didn't just commit fraud against the families he hurt. He committed fraud against me. He lied about money, about business, about everything. He had an affair for a year and a half while telling me I was the most important person in his life. He put our shared assets at risk with his illegal deals without ever telling me. He stole 8 years of my life by making me believe in a marriage that didn't exist. I turned to Judge Henderson. Mr. Morrison says Derek has been punished enough, that he's suffered, that he attempted suicide. And all of that is true. But suffering isn't the same as accountability. Derek is suffering because he got caught, because his comfortable life imploded, because he has to face consequences. That's not the same as genuinely understanding the harm he caused or committing to being a better person. If Derek walks out of here with minimal punishment, what does that tell the families he hurt? What does it tell other people who are considering similar crimes? That if you're educated and well-spoken and know how to perform remorse, you can get away with destroying people's lives. I paused, trying to organize my thoughts. I'm not here to ask for the maximum sentence. I'm not here out of revenge or vindictiveness. I'm here because I need Derek to understand, really understand, that actions have consequences. That you can't lie and cheat and hurt people and then expect mercy just because you're sorry you got caught. The families Derek hurt deserve justice. They deserve to know that the system actually protects them, not just the powerful people who victimize them. I looked at Derek one more time. I loved you, I said quietly. For 8 years, I loved you. And you threw that away. You threw everything away because you were too weak and too selfish to do the right thing. I genuinely hope, that whatever sentence you receive, you use that time to become the person you should have been all along. Not for me, not for your mother or your sister, but for yourself. Because the Derek Calloway I married doesn't exist, and maybe he never did. But maybe, someday, a better version of you can exist. I hope so. For everyone's sake, I hope so. I walked back to my seat in complete silence. The courtroom felt suspended, everyone holding their breath. Shanice reached over and squeezed my hand, and I saw Margaret nodding slowly from the back row, tears running down her face. Judge Henderson cleared her throat. Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan. That was very powerful testimony. She looked at Derek. Mr. Calloway, do you wish to address the court before I pass sentence? Derek stood slowly, his shackles rattling. For a long moment, he just stood there, swaying slightly, looking at the judge. Then he turned and looked at me. Grace, he said, and his voice was hoarse. I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I know sorry doesn't fix anything. But I need you to know that I did love you. I do love you. I didn't know how to be the person you deserved. I didn't know how to be honest when being honest meant admitting I was failing. So I lied. And I kept lying. And it got so big that I couldn't find my way back to the truth. He turned to Rosa Martinez and the other victims. I'm sorry to all of you. You deserved better. You deserve someone who would protect you, not someone who would exploit you for profit. I can't undo what I did, but I swear I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to make some kind of amends. He looked back at the judge. Your Honor, I'm guilty of everything they said I did. I'm guilty of being a coward and a liar and a cheat. I don't deserve mercy. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry, for whatever that's worth. He sat down, and Judge Henderson studied him for a long moment. Then she opened a file in front of her and began to read. Derek Calloway, this court has carefully considered the pre-sentencing report, the statements from victims, the arguments from counsel, and the testimony presented during trial. Your crimes were serious and caused substantial harm to vulnerable members of our community. The court notes your expressions of remorse, but the court also notes that remorse is easy to express when facing consequences. True remorse is demonstrated through actions, through accepting responsibility, and through making genuine efforts to repair the harm caused. She paused, looking directly at Derek. The sentencing guidelines for your crimes recommend 7 to 12 years in federal prison. The prosecution has requested the maximum. The defense has requested alternatives to incarceration. This court must balance punishment, deterrence, and the possibility of rehabilitation. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Therefore, Judge Henderson continued, it is the sentence of this court that you serve 8 years in federal prison, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. During your supervised release, you will be required to complete 500 hours of community service working with housing advocacy organizations. You will also be required to make restitution to the victims in the amount determined by the court, to be paid according to a schedule that accounts for your earning potential upon release. 8 years. The words echoed in my head. 8 years, the same length of time we'd been married. It felt like cosmic justice, like the universe balancing scales I hadn't even known existed. Derek's head dropped forward, and his shoulders shook. Morrison put a hand on his back, speaking quietly to him. Rosa Martinez let out a sob of relief. Margaret sat stone-faced, processing the fact that her son would be in prison until he was in his mid-40s. Judge Henderson wasn't finished. Mr. Calloway, I want to be very clear about something. This sentence is not about revenge. It's about accountability. It's about sending a message that we do not tolerate people in positions of privilege exploiting those who are vulnerable. You had every advantage in life, education, family support, opportunities, and you squandered all of it through greed and dishonesty. Perhaps 8 years will give you time to reflect on who you want to be when you're released. I genuinely hope you use that time wisely. She struck her gavel. Court is adjourned. And just like that, it was over. Derek was led out of the courtroom in his shackles, and I watched him go without feeling anything. No satisfaction, no vindication, no relief. Just emptiness. The ending I'd worked so hard for had finally arrived, and I felt nothing. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Jennifer Walsh and Rosa Martinez. I slipped away before they could corner me, Shanice running interference to help me escape. We walked to a coffee shop 3 blocks away and sat in a corner booth, both of us too overwhelmed to speak. 8 years, Shanice finally said. That's a long time. Not long enough for the families he hurt, I said. But longer than I thought he'd get. How do you feel? It was the question everyone kept asking me, and I still didn't have a good answer. I feel like I should feel something more, I admitted. Relief or closure or something. But I just feel empty. Like I spent so much energy on revenge and justice that now that it's over, I don't know what to do with myself. Shanice reached across the table and took my hand. You grieve, she said simply. You let yourself feel whatever you need to feel. And then you start rebuilding. You figure out who Grace Sullivan is without Derek, without the anger, without the mission of bringing him down. You figure out who you are now. She was right, of course. But figuring out who I was now felt impossible. I'd spent 8 years being Derek's wife, and then 7 months being his destroyer. Who was I without those identities? That evening, I went back to my apartment and did something I hadn't allowed myself to do since this whole nightmare began. I looked through old photos of Derek and me. Our wedding day, both of us so young and hopeful. Vacations to the Oregon coast, hiking trips in the gorge, lazy Sunday mornings in our old house. We looked happy in every photo. We looked like a real couple, in love, building a future. Had it all been a lie? Or had there been something real there once, before Derek's choices destroyed it? I'd never know for sure. Maybe some of it had been real. Maybe Derek had loved me in his own broken, selfish way. But it hadn't been enough. Love without honesty is just pretty lies, and I deserved more than that. I put the photos away and opened my laptop. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe enough to think about my future instead of Derek's past. I started researching graduate programs in social work, something I'd always wanted to pursue but had put off because Derek and I were saving for a house or waiting for the right time. There was no right time anymore. There was just now, and the rest of my life stretching out in front of me, full of possibilities I'd been too afraid or too comfortable to explore before. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into rebuilding. I applied to graduate programs. I took on a new project at work helping to establish a legal defense fund for refugees facing deportation. I started running again, something I'd loved in college but had given up somewhere along the way. I went on a few dates that went nowhere, but at least I was trying. And slowly, painfully, I started to feel like myself again. Not the Grace who'd been married to Derek, and not the Grace who'd been consumed by revenge, but a new Grace. Someone stronger, wiser, more cautious but also more brave. Someone who'd learned that sometimes love isn't enough, that trust has to be earned, and that the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than comfortable lies. Margaret called me in early November, a month after Derek's sentencing. I visited him, she said without preamble. In prison. I thought you should know. I didn't know what to say to that. How is he? Alive, Margaret said dryly. Adjusting, I suppose. He's in a minimum security facility, which is about as comfortable as prison can be. He asked about you. My heart clenched. What did you tell him? I told him you were doing well. That you'd filed for graduate school, that you were moving on with your life. He cried. Margaret paused. Grace, I know this is complicated, but do you think you might ever visit him? Not now, maybe not for years, but someday. I thought about it. 8 years from now, Derek would be released. He'd be in his mid-40s, starting over the way I was starting over now. Would I want to see him then? Would I want to know who he'd become? I don't know, I told Margaret honestly. Maybe someday, but not for a long time. I need to figure out who I am first, without him. I understand, Margaret said. For what it's worth, Grace, I think you're one of the strongest people I've ever met. And I'm sorry, I'm so sorry I didn't see that earlier. I'm sorry I didn't appreciate you when you were part of our family. It was the apology I'd needed years ago, and hearing it now felt like a door finally closing. Thank you, Margaret, I said. That means a lot. We talked for a few more minutes, then said our goodbyes. I hung up feeling lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying a weight I hadn't even known was there. As Thanksgiving approached, I made plans to spend it with Shanice and her family. I was learning to build a new kind of family, one based on choice and loyalty rather than blood or legal obligation. I was learning that you could lose everything and still have something worth living for. On Thanksgiving Day, as I sat around Shanice's table surrounded by her husband, her kids, her sister who'd flown in from Seattle, I felt grateful in a way I'd never felt before. Grateful for survival. Grateful for truth. Grateful for second chances. Shanice raised her glass in a toast. To new beginnings, she said, looking at me. To new beginnings, I echoed, and I meant it. This wasn't the life I'd planned. It wasn't the future I'd imagined when I married Derek all those years ago. But it was mine, honestly mine, built on truth instead of lies. And that was worth more than any comfortable fiction ever could be. Time, I learned, doesn't heal all wounds, but it does teach you how to live with them. 2 years after Derek's sentencing, I stood at the podium of a community center in Northeast Portland, preparing to give a presentation about housing rights to a room full of refugees and low-income families. I'd completed my master's degree in social work, had started working for a legal aid organization that specialized in tenant rights, and had found my calling in fighting against exactly the kind of predatory practices Derek had engaged in. It was poetic justice, I suppose. Or maybe it was penance. Either way, it felt right. My life had settled into a new rhythm. I lived in a small house in the Selwood neighborhood, nothing fancy, but mine, bought with my own money and my own credit. I'd adopted a cat named Justice. Shanice had rolled her eyes at the name, but I'd insisted. I had a small circle of close friends, a job I loved, and a peace I'd never known during my marriage. I didn't date much. A few failed attempts had taught me that I wasn't ready for that kind of vulnerability yet. Maybe someday. But for now, I was content being alone, being whole, being enough for myself. Derek had been transferred to a medium security facility after a year when another inmate had assaulted him. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to warrant a move. Margaret sent me updates occasionally, whether I wanted them or not. She said Derek was taking college courses, working in the prison library, seeing a therapist regularly. She said he'd changed, that he was genuinely trying to become a better person. I didn't know if I believed her. People don't change that easily, that completely. But maybe Derek was trying. Maybe 8 years would be enough time for him to figure out who he should have been all along. I'd thought about visiting him exactly once, about 6 months after his sentencing. I'd even driven to the prison, sat in the parking lot for an hour, staring at the razor wire and guard towers. But I hadn't gone in. I wasn't ready. Maybe I never would be. That chapter of my life was closed, and I didn't need to reopen it to find closure. I'd found closure on my own terms, in my own time, in my own way. Vanessa Park had left Portland shortly after the trial, moved to San Francisco according to mutual friends. Marcus Chen's firm had survived the scandal but barely. He'd settled a dozen lawsuits from former clients and had restructured the business entirely. I'd seen him once from across the street, looking older and defeated. I'd felt nothing, no anger, no satisfaction, nothing. He was irrelevant to my life now. Rosa Martinez had become something like a friend. We'd bonded over our shared experience with Derek's fraud, and she'd eventually come to work as a community organizer with one of my partner organizations. Her kids were doing better. The oldest had gotten a scholarship to Portland State. The youngest had stopped having nightmares. They'd moved into stable housing and were rebuilding their lives, just like I was. "You saved my family," Rosa told me once, and I'd shaken my head. "No," I'd said. "You saved your family. I just helped expose the person who hurt you. You did all the hard work of surviving and rebuilding." But Rosa had insisted, and eventually I'd learned to accept gratitude without deflecting it. I'd learned that sometimes you could be someone's hero without meaning to be, just by standing up for what was right. In the spring of my 3rd year post-divorce, I got an unexpected letter. It was from Derek, forwarded through Margaret because he didn't have my current address. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it, debating whether I even wanted to know what he had to say. Finally, curiosity won. The letter was surprisingly simple. Dear Grace, I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect you to respond. I don't expect anything from you anymore. You've given me more than I deserved just by existing, by being the moral compass I should have followed from the beginning. I'm writing because my therapist suggested it might help with my recovery to try to apologize properly, to own what I did without making excuses or asking for forgiveness. So here it is. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every lie I told you. I'm sorry for the affair, for the fraud, for putting you in a position where you had to choose between protecting me and doing the right thing. I'm sorry for making you doubt yourself, for stealing 8 years of your life, for breaking promises I should never have made if I wasn't strong enough to keep them. You deserved a partner who was honest and faithful and brave. You deserved someone who would build a real life with you, not a house of cards that collapsed the moment anyone looked too closely. I wasn't that person. I don't know if I ever will be, but I'm trying. I've spent 3 years in here thinking about who I was and who I want to be. I've taken responsibility for my crimes. I don't blame my father's debt, or the pressure, or the system anymore. I made choices. Bad choices. Choices that hurt real people with real lives. I accept that. I'm working on restitution. I've been taking paralegal courses and I'm hoping to work in prison reform advocacy when I'm released. It won't undo the harm I caused, but maybe it can prevent other people from making my mistakes. I heard through my mom that you got your master's degree, that you're working in tenant rights. That's perfect for you. You always cared about people in a way I never learned how to. You always saw the humanity in everyone. I'm glad you're doing well. I'm glad you found a way to turn all of this pain into something meaningful. If there's one good thing that came out of this nightmare, it's that maybe more families will be protected because you're out there fighting for them. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't forgive myself. But I wanted you to know that I see what I did now. I understand the full weight of it. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Take care of yourself, Grace. You deserve every good thing this world has to offer. Derek**. I read the letter 3 times, and each time, I felt something different. The first time, anger that he thought a letter could somehow make up for everything. The second time, sadness for the man he might have been if he'd made better choices. The third time, nothing. Just a distant acknowledgement that yes, Derek was sorry, and yes, he was probably being genuine, but it didn't change anything. I couldn't forgive him. Maybe I never would. But I also didn't need to forgive him to move on. I'd already moved on. Derek's guilt and redemption were his burdens to carry, not mine. I filed the letter away in a box with our divorce papers and Thomas's original evidence and all the other relics of that chapter of my life. Then I went about my day, fed Justice, went for a run, met Shanice for coffee, reviewed case files for work. My life, full and real and honest in a way it had never been when I was married to Derek. That summer, I started dating someone new. His name was Michael Chen, no relation to Marcus. Portland had a lot of Chens, and he was a public defender I'd worked with on a few cases. He was kind and honest and maybe a little boring, but after Derek, boring felt like a gift. Stable felt like luxury. Truth felt like oxygen. I told Michael everything on our third date, about Derek, the fraud, the affair, the revenge I'd taken. I laid it all out, expecting him to run, expecting judgment or fear or at least hesitation. Instead, he'd taken my hand and said, "That must have been incredibly painful. I'm sorry you went through that. But it sounds like you did exactly what needed to be done." No judgment. No fear. Just acceptance. It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me. We took things slow, coffee dates and walks through Forest Park and long conversations about everything and nothing. Michael didn't push for more than I was ready to give, didn't pressure me to move faster than I wanted to go. He was patient in a way Derek had never been, present in a way Derek had never managed. 6 months into dating Michael, Margaret called with news I'd been half expecting. Derek was up for early release. He'd been a model prisoner, had completed multiple education programs, had excellent reports from his therapists and counselors. The parole board was considering releasing him after 5 years instead of 8. "How do you feel about that?" Margaret asked. I thought about it honestly. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me thinks he hasn't served enough time. Part of me thinks it doesn't matter how long he's in there. Either he's changed or he hasn't, and time won't make that difference." "The parole board wants to interview character witnesses," Margaret said. "People who knew Derek before and who can speak to whether he's genuinely rehabilitated. They asked if you might be willing to testify." The request shocked me. Why would they want to hear from me? I'm the person he hurt most. "Exactly," Margaret said. "If you can speak to his character, to whether you believe he's changed, it carries more weight than anything I or his therapist could say. But Grace, I'm not asking you to do this. I'm just passing along the request. If you say no, I completely understand." I told her I'd think about it. That night, I talked it over with Michael, with Shanice, with Dr. Kim. Everyone had different opinions. Michael thought I should refuse. "You don't owe Derek anything." Shanice thought I should testify but tell the truth, let them know he hurt people and let them decide if he's changed. Dr. Kim asked what I thought, which was her way of making me confront my own feelings instead of hiding behind other people's advice. What did I think? I thought Derek had hurt a lot of people. I thought 5 years wasn't very long. I thought early release felt like he was getting off easy. But I also thought about his letter, about the genuine remorse that had come through in every line. I thought about the reports Margaret had shared, about Derek's therapy and education and transformation. And I thought about the person I'd become, someone who believed in rehabilitation, who believed people could change, who believed in second chances even when they were hard to give. In the end, I agreed to testify at Derek's parole hearing. Not because I owed him anything, but because I owed it to myself to be honest, to speak my truth one final time, and then to let go of this weight I'd been carrying for 5 years. The hearing was held at the prison on a cold November morning. I dressed professionally, a navy suit, my hair down, minimal makeup. I looked confident and put together, nothing like the broken woman who'd sat at Thomas Calloway's funeral 5 years ago wondering why her husband wanted to leave. The hearing room was small and institutional. Derek sat at a table with his attorney, wearing prison khakis and a button-down shirt, looking older but healthier than I remembered. His face was less gaunt, his eyes clearer. He looked like someone who'd been through hell and survived it. When he saw me walk in, his eyes widened and he half stood before his attorney pulled him back down. I took my seat at the witness table and waited. The parole board consisted of 3 people, 2 men and a woman, all middle-aged, all looking tired from hearing too many stories about too many broken people. "Mrs. Sullivan," the woman began, "thank you for agreeing to testify. We understand this is difficult. We've read your victim impact statement from the original trial, but that was 5 years ago. We'd like to hear your current perspective on Derek Calloway's rehabilitation and fitness for release." I took a breath and began. 5 years ago, Derek Calloway destroyed my life. He lied to me for years, betrayed my trust, committed fraud that hurt vulnerable families, and then tried to escape consequences through a suicide attempt. At that time, I wanted him to serve every possible day of his sentence. I wanted him to suffer the way he'd made others suffer. I paused, looking directly at Derek. He was watching me with an intensity that was almost painful, tears already streaming down his face. But 5 years is a long time. I've rebuilt my life. I've healed. I've learned that revenge doesn't actually fix anything, it just proves that someone did something wrong. And I've learned that people can change if they're willing to do the hard work. I turned back to the parole board. I don't know if Derek has changed. I haven't seen him, haven't spoken to him in 5 years. All I have are his letters, his mother's reports, and his institutional record. Based on those things, it seems like he's trying. He's taking responsibility, he's getting therapy, he's working toward making amends. I took another breath. But here's what I need this board to understand. Whether Derek is released in 5 years or 8 years doesn't change what he did. It doesn't undo the harm he caused. Those families he hurt, they're still recovering. Rosa Martinez's family is still dealing with the trauma of displacement. Other families lost savings, lost stability, lost faith in the system that was supposed to protect them. "So what are you recommending?" one of the male board members asked. "I'm recommending that you do your job," I said firmly. "Don't release Derek because you feel sorry for him or because he's good at performing remorse. Release him only if you genuinely believe he won't reoffend, that he understands the full weight of what he did, that he's prepared to spend the rest of his life making amends. Because if he gets out and hurts more people, that's on you. That's on this system that's supposed to protect vulnerable people, not give predators more opportunities to hurt them." The board members nodded, taking notes. "And if we do release him," the woman asked, "would you be comfortable with that decision?" I thought about it honestly. Comfortable? No. But I'd accept it, if I believed you'd made a thorough assessment. I don't need Derek to stay in prison for my healing. I've already healed without him. This isn't about me anymore. It's about whether he's genuinely changed and whether society is safer with him in prison or trying to rebuild his life on the outside. "Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan," the woman said. "Is there anything else you'd like to add?" I looked at Derek one last time. "Yes," I said. "Derek, if you get released, I want you to know something. I can't forgive you. Maybe I never will. But I can accept that you might be trying to become a better person. I can hope, for everyone's sake, that you succeed. But if you hurt more people, if you lie or cheat or take advantage of anyone's vulnerability, I will find out. And I will make sure you go right back where you came from. Do you understand?" Derek nodded, unable to speak, tears still streaming down his face. "I understand," he finally managed to choke out. "Grace, thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being honest. I don't deserve your hope, but I'll try to earn it. I swear I'll try." I stood up. "Don't try for me," I said quietly. "Try for Rosa Martinez and her kids. Try for all the families you hurt. Try because it's the right thing to do, not because you think it'll earn you redemption or forgiveness. Some things can't be forgiven, Derek. Sometimes you just have to live with what you've done and try to be better anyway." I walked out of that hearing room without looking back. Michael was waiting for me in the parking lot, and when I got in the car, I finally let myself cry, not for Derek, not for our failed marriage, but for the girl I'd been 5 years ago who'd thought love was enough. Who'd thought trust was simple. Who'd believed that good people always won and bad people always lost. I'd learned so much since then. I'd learned that the world was more complicated than that people were more complicated than that. I'd learned that sometimes the right thing to do hurt like hell, and sometimes revenge felt empty even when it was justified. I'd learned that healing wasn't linear, that forgiveness wasn't required, that you could survive anything if you just kept putting one foot in front of the other. The parole board released their decision 2 weeks later. Derek would be released on parole after completing his 5th year. He'd have strict conditions, regular check-ins with a parole officer, continued therapy, community service working with housing advocacy organizations, and a prohibition on working in real estate for the rest of his life. It felt like a mixed result. Not justice, exactly, but maybe a chance at redemption. When Margaret called to tell me, I felt nothing. Not anger, not relief, not satisfaction. Just a distant acknowledgement that Derek's story was continuing, but it wasn't my story anymore. My story was about Michael and me planning a weekend trip to the coast. My story was about the tenant rights case I'd just won, saving 3 families from wrongful eviction. My story was about Shanice's daughter asking me to be her confirmation sponsor, about Justice the cat stealing my spot on the couch, about small, real, honest moments that added up to a life worth living. Derek had taken 8 years from me, 8 years of marriage built on lies. But he'd also, inadvertently, given me something, the knowledge that I was strong enough to survive betrayal, brave enough to demand justice, resilient enough to rebuild from nothing. I was Grace Sullivan, and I didn't need Derek Calloway or revenge or even closure to be whole. I was already whole. I'd been whole all along. I just hadn't known it until everything else was stripped away. 5 years after Thomas Calloway's funeral, I sat on my porch watching the Portland rain fall and thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the revenge, the justice, the cost, the healing. It had been the worst time of my life and the best time of my life, somehow simultaneously. It had broken me and remade me into someone stronger, someone better, someone more honest about who she was and what she deserved. If I could go back to that woman sitting at the funeral, listening to her husband whisper about looking under the table, would I change anything? Would I warn her about the pain ahead, the cost of revenge, the emptiness that sometimes comes with justice? No. Because that pain, that cost, that emptiness, it had all led me here. To this porch, this life, this version of myself that I actually liked, maybe even loved. Derek's betrayal had destroyed my marriage, but it had saved me from a life of comfortable lies. His crimes had devastated families, but exposing them had helped protect future victims. His weakness had tried to take me down, but instead, it had shown me how strong I really was. So here's what I want you to take away from my story. If you've made it this far, betrayal will break you. But you get to decide what you become after you break. Revenge might feel necessary, but it won't heal you. Justice might not feel satisfying, but it matters anyway. And healing, real healing, doesn't come from watching your betrayer suffer. It comes from building a life so honest, so full, so real that the lies of the past become irrelevant. I'm Grace Sullivan. I was married to a fraud and a liar. I destroyed his life to protect others and to reclaim my own. And I'd do it again, even knowing the cost, even knowing the pain, even knowing that justice sometimes feels like ashes in your mouth. Because the alternative, staying silent, protecting him, living with lies, that would have destroyed me completely. At least this way, I survived. At least this way, I became someone I could respect. At least this way, when I look in the mirror, I see someone who stood up for what was right, even when it hurt. Even when it cost everything. That's enough. That has to be enough. And you know what? It is. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever faced betrayal or had to make impossible choices, I want you to know, you're stronger than you think. You can survive things you never imagined surviving. And on the other side of that survival, there's a life waiting for you that's more honest, more real, more yours than anything you had before. Check the description box below for more stories like this. Stories about survival, about standing up for yourself, about the complicated, messy, beautiful process of becoming who you're meant to be. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here with me through all of it. And wherever you're watching from, whatever you're going through, remember, you deserve truth. You deserve honesty. You deserve a life built on something real. Don't settle for anything less. I didn't. And neither should you.